connection, the Assembly has before it draft resolution in document A/ES 10/L27 and draft amendments A/ES 10/L28 and A/ES 10/L29. The President will now deliver a statement. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, this past week, it was with a very heavy heart that I read the letter addressed to me by UNRWA Commissioner General Philip Lazzarini. That letter, on which many of your missions were also copied, highlighted the devastating deterioration of the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. As Commissioner General Lazzarini himself predicted in his letter, the situation has since deteriorated further. Right now, what we are seeing is an onslaught on civilians, the breakdown of humanitarian systems, and profound disrespect for both international law and international humanitarian law. As I said before, even war has rules, and it is imperative that we prevent any deviation from these principles and values, the validity of which resides in their universal application. Tens of thousands have been killed, almost 70% of them women and children. Even more have been forcibly displaced by the incessant violence, with nowhere, I repeat, nowhere safe to go. And the targeting of hospitals, schools, and UN-provided shelters, now so overcrowded that they have ceased to function as safe havens, continues unabated. All the while, the blockade on humanitarian assistance has made the delivery of urgently needed life-saving aid near impossible. Excellencies, clearly, what we are witnessing is the unprecedented collapse of an already crumbling humanitarian system in real time. It is incumbent upon us, as the United Nations, to bring an immediate end to the suffering of innocent civilians, the mounting death toll of those who are not, I repeat, are not combatants in this war, and to this untenable humanitarian catastrophe. Thanks to several countries' relentless efforts, a temporary humanitarian truce enabled the release of hostages, the freeing of detainees, and the delivery of some aid. However, since the 1st of December, we are witnessing the resumption of violence with a kind of ferocity that one asks, what more next. Civilians should never undergo the level of suffering we are currently witnessing. And again, I ask, how many more thousands of lives must be lost before we do something? No more time is left. The carnage must stop. For as long as this violence persists, a political solution to this conflict will continue to be undermined. The longer it takes, the higher the risk that a negotiated two-state solution will increasingly become out of reach. So the fact of the matter is, quite simply, the violence must stop. It must. I therefore once again add my voice to the demand of for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. We have one singular priority, only one: to save lives. Excellencies, casting our gaze towards the future, we must assess the situation with honesty in our hearts, truth in our words, and a commitment to peace as our utmost ambition. A ceasefire is the only realistic first step towards de-escalating tensions. How can we possibly listen to each other over the deafening thundering of bombs? On 26th October, you gathered in this chamber with the membership resoundingly and unequivocally calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. On December 7th, once more, a veto was cast in the Security Council. Once again, this emergency special session has been resumed. We certainly cannot continue in this way without even the possibility, let alone the prospect, for a meaningful solution. As President of the General Assembly, I am committed to supporting any and all efforts to put an end to the bloodshed and the psychological torture of the people in Gaza. I used my recent attendance at the Doha Forum and every other platform I can to encourage cooperation among states with the same singular goal in mind: to make peace for all. In the name of humanity, I ask you all once again, stop this violence now. I thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt to introduce draft resolution A/ES 10/L27.
سيد الرئيس، أشكركم بنيابتي عن المجموعة العربية على سرعة الاستجابة لعقد هذا الاجتماع بناء على طلب المجموعتين العربية والإسلامية في محاولة لتجاوز ما شهده العالم من عرقلة لمحاولات مجلس الأمن تحمل مسؤولياته عبر المطالبة بإنفاذ وقف إنساني فوري لإطلاق النار بالأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة. وما شهدناه جميعاً من استخدام جائر لحق النقد ضد مشروع قرار لوقف إطلاق النار الإنساني بعد أن حاز على دعم أكثر من 100 عضو بالأمم المتحدة في ظرف ساعات معدودة، مما يعد مؤشراً على إدراك الغالبية العظمى من المجتمع الدولي لخطورة وجسامة الوضع الراهن وانعكاساته الكارثية على السلم والأمن الدوليين. سيد الرئيس، مشروع القرار المقدم المرفوع للجمعية العامة اليوم A/ES/10/L27 بسيط المضمون، واضح الأركان، صريح الغرض، ويقع في 4 فقرات عاملة فقط، إلا أن إنفاذ ما ورد بهذه الفقرات أعجز المجتمع الدولي لمدة جاوزت الشهرين، رغم وضوح الوضع الإنساني الكارثي الذي يعانيه أشقاؤنا الفلسطينيون وسط الهجمات البربرية التي تشنها قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي ضد المدنيين في غزة، والتي أفضت إلى معاناة إنسانية تجاوزت كل الحدود وتهديداً جدياً للسلم والأمن الدوليين. دفع السكرتير عام الأمم المتحدة ولأول مرة منذ توليه منصبه ومنذ عدة عقود إلى مخاطبة مجلس الأمن إنفاذاً للمادة 99 من ميثاق الأمم المتحدة للمطالبة بما يطالب به مشروع القرار: وقف إطلاق نار إنساني بسبب ما نتج عن هذا العدوان من انهيار للنظام الصحي والمخاوف من قرب انهيار النظام العام ونظام الدعم الإنساني في غزة، واستحالة إدارة العمليات الإنسانية هناك، وهو ما دفع أيضاً المفوض العام لوكالة الأونروا لتوجيه خطاب لكم سيد الرئيس لتسليط الضوء على الوضع الإنساني المتدهور في قطاع غزة وخطورته على قدرة الأونروا على الوفاء بمهامها، ناهيك عن خطورته على سلامة وأمن موظفي الوكالة. سيد الرئيس، تؤكد المجموعة العربية أن مساعي أقلية من الدول الرامية للتصدي للرأي العام الدولي المطالب بوقف إطلاق النار بذرائع ومبررات واهية متعلقة بحق إسرائيل في الدفاع عن نفسها تتجاهل عن عمد أن هذا الحق لا ينطبق على إسرائيل في احتلالها للأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة باعتبارها قوة الاحتلال غير الشرعية، وتتجاهل أيضاً أن هذا الحق لا يعفي حال تطبيقه من الالتزام بأبسط قيم الإنسانية ومبادئ القانون الدولي وقواعد القانون الدولي الآمرة التي تقي النساء والأطفال والمدنيين العزل وسط الحروب. إن تلك المساعي المؤسفة تمثل صورة مقيتة من صور ازدواجية المعايير، والتي نجد فيها بعض الدول تطالب بوقف العدوان والحرب والاحتلال والهجوم على المدنيين، وتطالب باحترام القانون الدولي والقانون الدولي الإنساني في حالات، ولكنها للأسف وبشكل مخزن تدير ظهرها لهذه المطالبات في حالات أخرى، خاصة عندما تتعلق بالإنسان الفلسطيني وحقه في العيش بأمان على أرضه وفي دولته المستقلة ووقف جرائم الحرب التي ترتكب ضده بلا هوادة. سيد الرئيس، السادة الأعضاء، إن اعتماد ثم إنفاذ مشروع القرار قيد نظر الجمعية العامة اليوم وفي قلبه المطالبة بوقف إطلاق النار هو وحده الكفيل بإنقاذ أرواح الأبرياء، إذ تتناول الفقرة الديباجية السادسة للمشروع بكل توازن وحياد، على عكس ما قد يدعيه البعض، ضرورة حماية المدنيين من الجانبين وفقاً للقانون الدولي الإنساني. كما يطالب المشروع في فقراته العاملة كافة الأطراف بالامتثال للالتزام بحماية المدنيين، ويطالب كذلك بإطلاق سراح كافة الرهائن وضمان النفاذ الإنساني. سيد الرئيس، إن استمرار هذه الحرب المدمرة سيؤدي إلى كارثة متكاملة الأركان، ويعني بكل الأسف الإذعان لتكتيكات الإبادة الجماعية كأداة من أدوات الحرب، بما يهدم كل قواعد القانون الدولي الآمرة، ويجر المنطقة بأسرها إلى أتون حرب إقليمية، وقد يعصف بما تبقى من مصداقية هذه المنظمة الدولية. سيد الرئيس، تناشد المجموعة العربية كافة الدول الأعضاء دعم مشروع القرار المطروح أمامكم، تطبيقاً للكيل بمكيال واحد، وحفاظاً على القيم الإنسانية، ودعماً للمصلحة المشتركة لكافة أطراف المجتمع الدولي في الحفاظ على السلم والأمن الدوليين. كما تدعو المجموعة العربية كافة الوفود إلى التصويت ضد أي تعديلات مقدمة على هذا المشروع التي لم يتم التشاور بشأنها مع الدول الراعية للقرار، وذلك حرصاً بشكل أساسي على الحفاظ على نصه المتوازن والمباشر، والذي تم صياغته لتتطابق بنوده مع بنود مشروع القرار الذي طرح على مجلس الأمن تحقيقاً لأولوية لا تعلوها أولوية أخرى أياً كانت، لهدف واضح وصريح ومحدد: وقف إطلاق النار الإنساني، حرصاً على عدم خلط الأوراق من جانب الوفود التي تقدمت بتلك التعديلات، بعد أن صوتت نفس تلك الوفود ضد قرار الجمعية العامة الذي اعتمد في شهر أكتوبر الماضي في نفس تلك الدورة الطريقة المستأنفة، وتضمن المطالبة بهدنة إنسانية تفضي إلى وقف العمليات العدائية، وهو ما يفضح الغرض الحقيقي وراء تلك التعديلات. للأسف استمرار العدوان ونزيف دماء الأبرياء. سيد الرئيس، السادة الأعضاء، ماذا ننتظر جميعا حتى نخمد هذه النار؟ ماذا ننتظر حتى ننهي هذه الحرب التي لا منتصر فيها؟ ماذا ننتظر حتى نوقف القتل ونخمد آلة الدمار؟ بل هل نستطيع الانتظار أصلاً بعد أن تخطى عدد القتلى من المدنيين أكثر من 18,000 شهيد، من ضمنهم أكثر من 7,000 طفل، بمعدل يبلغ مقتل طفل كل 10 دقائق، بالإضافة إلى عدد جرحى جاوز بينما نتحدث 49,000 جريح. سادة الأعضاء، أخاطب ضمائركم جميعا وأناشدكم مساندة مشروع القرار لوقف نزيف الدماء، كل الدماء. A word on the procedure, Honorable President. I sincerely ask you, Mr. President, to suspend the debate following the introductions to proceed to take action on the draft resolution A/ES/10/L25 without delay, given the urgency of the situation on the ground and the importance of a global call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, with the understanding that the debate would resume immediately after action and the adoption of the resolution, and that emergency session 10 would only be temporarily adjourned after the conclusion of the debate. And I do thank you, Mr. President. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria to introduce Amendment A/ES10/L28.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, colleagues, and friends, I have the honor to introduce to you draft Amendment L28, proposed by Austria on Resolution L27, entitled protection of civilians, and upholding legal and humanitarian obligations. We meet today in this emergency special session to address the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. Austria is deeply concerned by the escalation following the heinous terrorist attacks by Hamas on Israeli civilians on 7 October. As our President stressed earlier, Austria has also continuously underlined the importance of ensuring the protection of all civilians at all times. Every civilian death is one too many. We have also called on more humanitarian aid to reach those in need and have increased our own contributions to humanitarian organizations. We very much welcome the humanitarian pauses and corridors that enable the release of some hostages and the provisions of urgently needed humanitarian aid. The recent escalation of violence started with Hamas' brutal, indiscriminate terrorist attacks across Israel on 7 October, and this deserves to be condemned in the strongest possible terms. As any state that suffers such an attack, Israel also has the right to defend its citizens in line with international law and international humanitarian law, and will therefore also support the amendment introduced by the United States. Austria has thoroughly considered the draft resolution before us today. We recognize the efforts by the Arab group to present a short and concise text, and we welcome that this text, in comparison to the resolution presented in October, explicitly demands the release of all hostages and also demands humanitarian access. However, this resolution falls short in many ways, including the right of Israel to ensure its citizens are safe and in naming the terrorist group responsible for the taking of hostages. The innocent children, women, and men held captive in Gaza have not simply disappeared or lost their way. They were abducted by Hamas. We can't just ignore this fact. The reports of those freed clearly show Hamas' brutality and complete disregard for human dignity. It's with this purpose that Austria presented a short, constructive amendment that's based on agreed language from UN Security Council Resolution 2712, adopted on 15 November of this year. This resolution called for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups, and ensuring immediate humanitarian access. This is the exact language that our amendment that we are proposing today proposes to add. We are here today because there was another veto in the UN Security Council. And just a few weeks ago, the Security Council was able to name Hamas in a resolution that was adopted. The UN General Assembly should also have the courage to do the same. We therefore ask all of you to support the amendment we have put before you and vote yes. If that amendment passes, Austria will be able to join others in abstaining on the whole text. We will also continue working with all partners to ensure safety and security for Israelis and Palestinians alike. All of them, Palestinians, Israelis, deserve a peaceful future and the restoration of a political process leading to a two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Austria, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States to introduce the draft amendment in A/ES10/L29. You have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, the last 2 months have been nothing short of devastating. Devastating for Palestinians who have lost their homes and their loved ones because of a conflict that Hamas set into motion. Devastating for Israelis who still face a barrage of rocket fire, even as they continue to reel from Hamas's barbaric attacks on October 7th. Devastating for Jewish and Muslim people around the world who are targeted by rising levels of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And devastating for all those who dream of a sustainable peace in which Israelis and Palestinians enjoy equal measures of security, dignity, and freedom. That sustainable peace is what the United States wants to work towards. And that is what I believe so many members of this body want to work towards too. And indeed, there are aspects of this resolution that we do support. We agree that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire and requires urgent and sustained attention, that civilians desperately need food and water and shelter and medical care, that a devastating number of innocent people have been killed, and that civilians must be protected, consistent with international humanitarian law. In addition, we support the release of all hostages immediately and unconditionally. Roughly half of those kidnapped on October 7th remain in Gaza. That's over 100 people, subject to, as a number of released hostages have described, hell. And so we encourage you to vote yes on the amendment proposed by Austria, which, like the resolution passed in the Security Council on November 15th, call for Hamas and other groups to release the hostages and to provide humanitarian access to them immediately. Again, we support components of the resolution proposed today. But here's what else we support. We support speaking out with one voice to condemn Hamas for its terrorist actions on October 7th. Why is that so hard? To say unequivocally that murdering babies and gunning down parents in front of their children is horrific, that burning down houses while families shelter inside and taking civilians hostage is abhorrent. It's why today the United States is proposing an amendment that unequivocally rejects and condemns these atrocities. And we urge all members to vote yes and declare that what happened on October 7th is intolerable, period. This is the bare minimum, and it should not be that difficult. In addition, the United States supports immediately addressing the reports of horrific sexual violence unleashed by Hamas on and after October 7th. Over the last 20 years, the UN has repeatedly underscored the need to investigate all reports of conflict-related sexual violence. It's long past time every member apply that same standard to the assaults committed by Hamas. The United States also supports the ICRC having access to hostages to provide medical treatment. We support a resumption of humanitarian pauses, which could happen immediately if Hamas only agreed to release women, wounded, and civilian hostages. We have seen how critical these pauses are to get the hostages out and to give some respite to civilians and humanitarians in Gaza. Look, there's no shortage of rhetoric here in New York, but it's the diplomacy the United States is engaging in on the ground that made that week-long pause possible. It was careful conversation and collaboration with Egypt and Qatar that helped reunite more than 100 hostages with their loved ones, and that dramatically expanded humanitarian assistance to Gaza during the break in fighting. Of course, we support even more aid getting into the hands of those who so urgently need it. Over the last week, Over the last week and a half, the United States has airlifted more than 90,000 pounds of humanitarian aid to Egypt's border, with more on the way. And we're working with Israel, Egypt, the UN, and others to surge humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Israel's decision to open Kerem Shalom for inspections and screening of those humanitarian goods is essential and something we have been working toward in earnest. And Israel's commitment to ensure there's enough fuel to sustain the humanitarian assistance operation, including civilian infrastructure, is also vital. We've made clear to Israel we expect it to honor these commitments, and we will hold them to it. Colleagues, there's more we support. We support a more robust deconfliction mechanism to help protect UN and humanitarian personnel, far too many of whom have lost their lives while heroically working to save innocent people in Gaza. We support affirming that Israel, like every single country on earth, has the right and the responsibility to defend its people from acts of terrorism. Because we know that Hamas intends to repeat the horrors of October 7th again and again and again. A senior Hamas official said so himself on television. Indeed, it was Hamas that broke the 7-day pause last month by committing a vicious terror attack in Jerusalem, firing rockets into Israel, and then failing to release the hostages it had pledged to release. Let's be realistic here. This is a terrorist group that no member state would tolerate living next to. So long as Hamas remains driven by its murderous ideology, any ceasefire right now would be temporary at the best and dangerous at worst. Dangerous to Israelis, who would be subject to relentless attacks, and also dangerous to Palestinians, who deserve the chance to build a better future for themselves, free from Hamas, a group that hides behind innocent civilians rather than protect them, and that co-opts civilian infrastructure to wage conflict. Of course, how Israel defends itself matters. Israel must avoid mass displacement of civilians in the south of Gaza. It must ensure sufficient humanitarian assistance to those who have fled violence, and it must allow civilians in Gaza to return home as soon as conditions allow. We will continue to press at the highest levels for this and for the protection of civilians as Israel pursues legitimate military objectives. Because perhaps most of all, while we cannot support a one-sided Security Council or General Assembly resolution that ignores so much of what we all stand for, we desperately want to see an end to the cycle of unceasing violence. Colleagues, our goal must be to stop the death, the devastation, and the destruction for the long term. And that is simply not a future Hamas wants to see. So as we address this immediate crisis and work to surge humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people, we must also work to build a foundation for a truly sustainable peace, one where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in states of their own, so that the next generation and the generations to come need not experience the devastation of the last 2 months and finally realize freedom, security, and peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the United States. The representative of Egypt has moved that the debate on agenda item 5 be suspended at this stage for the Assembly to proceed to the consideration of draft resolution AES10 L27, and that the debate would continue after the action on the draft resolution. It is my understanding that, without setting a precedent and given the urgency of the issue, if the Assembly were to decide to suspend the debate at this stage for the Assembly to proceed to the consideration of draft resolution A/ES10/L27 and to continue the debate after the action on the draft resolution, and if the Assembly were to adopt the draft resolution subsequently, the 10th emergency special session would be adjourned temporarily following the conclusion of the debate on item 5. Is there any objection to the motion? I see none. It is so decided. Since there is the Assembly shall now proceed to consider the draft resolution A/ES10/L27 and draft amendments A/ES10/L28 and A/ES10/L29. For your information, the draft resolution and draft amendments have closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Thank you, Mr. President. I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to the delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become co-sponsors of A/ES10/L27. Afghanistan, Angola, Antigua and Barbuda, Azerbaijan, Bahamas, Bangladesh, Barbados, Belarus, Belgium, Belize, Benin, the plurinational state of Bolivia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Botswana, Brazil, Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, the Central African Republic, Chad, Chile, China, Colombia, Congo, Costa Rica, Cuba, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Dominica, El Salvador, Ethiopia, Fiji, Finland, Gambia, Grenada, Guyana, Honduras, Iceland, Indonesia, Ireland, Jamaica, Kenya, Kyrgyzstan, Lao People's Democratic Republic, Lesotho, Luxembourg, Malaysia, Maldives, Malta, Mexico, Myanmar, Namibia, Nicaragua, Nigeria, Norway, Peru, Philippines, Portugal, the Russian Federation, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, San Marino, Senegal, Singapore, Slovenia, South Africa, Spain, Sri Lanka, Suriname, Tajikistan, Thailand, Timor-Leste, Trinidad and Tobago, Turkey, Turkmenistan, Uganda, Uzbekistan, Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, Vietnam, and Zimbabwe. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor A/ES10/L27, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. Guinea-Bissau, Eritrea, Zambia, Mozambique, Mozambique I already said, so that's it for this one. And then I would like to go to L28, and I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft amendment, and in addition to the delegation listed on the L document, the following countries have also become co-sponsors of A/ES10/L28: Albania, Canada, Cyprus, Czechia, Greece, Japan, Lithuania, Montenegro, Ukraine, and the United States of America. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor A/ES10/L28, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. United Kingdom, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Micronesia, that's it. And then I would like to go now to L29. I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft amendment, and in addition to the delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become co-sponsors of A/ES10/L29: Albania, Austria, Canada, Cyprus, Czechia, Germany, Greece, Japan, Lithuania, Montenegro, and Ukraine. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor A/ES10/L29, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. United Kingdom, Fiji, Micronesia, and Papua New Guinea. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. The Assembly will now proceed to take action on the draft resolution contained in A/ES10/L27 and amendments thereto contained in A/ES10/L28 and A/ES10/L29. Delegations wishing to make a statement in explanation of vote before the vote on any of the proposals under this item, including the proposed amendments, are invited to do so now in one intervention. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote before the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me start by expressing our gratitude to you for having convened this resumption of the emergency special session of the General Assembly, and in particular for your clarion call for an immediate ceasefire in the war that is taking place in Gaza. Mr. President, Pakistan supports the draft resolution submitted by the Arab and Islamic countries in L27. The resolution is identical in its text to the one which was voted upon in the Security Council, and its aim is to seek an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, to provide access for humanitarian assistance, and to call for the release of all, I repeat, all hostages. This resolution was co-sponsored by over 100 member states when it was submitted in the Security Council. It obtained the affirmative votes of 13 of the 15 Council members, but it failed to pass due to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Security Council. Yet, the international community is not without recourse. The UN Charter provides the General Assembly with considerable residual powers, and acting under the Uniting for Peace process, we can take action to demand a halt to the war which is taking place and killing thousands of people every week. The draft resolution is one we are confident will elicit the support of the vast majority of the UN membership. Pakistan has not co-sponsored this draft resolution, and we have not done so because we reserve the right to submit amendments to ensure that the text which is adopted by the General Assembly is equitable and balanced. And it is a matter, therefore, of deep regret, if not surprise, that some friends of Israel have introduced amendments to once again condemn only one side, but exonerate the other. Unlike Canada, I cannot appeal to their sense of equity and justice. But what we can do is to appeal to the sense of humanity, of justice and fairness of the rest of the UN membership. And I'm confident that this entire membership will not agree to place the blame only on Hamas, but not on Israel. That would be unjust, unfair, and inequitable. Mr. President, when you deny people freedom and dignity, when you humiliate and trap them in an open-air prison where you kill them as if they were beasts, they become very angry, and they do to others what was done to them. And therefore, for Austria and my friend from the United States to blame Hamas in their amendments is not equitable, is not just. The blame, if it's to be placed, has to be placed on both parties, and especially on Israel. Mr. President, with the end of the pause, the skies over Gaza are filled with projectiles of death. Attack helicopters, drones, artillery shells, tank shells, mortars, bombs, missiles. Israel has dropped 25,000 tons of explosives on Gaza, nearly the equivalent of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Israel's goal is not only to erase Hamas. This is a war against the Palestinian people. Israel's goal is to erase not only a people, but the entire idea of Palestine. Its campaign is a carbon copy of the massive campaigns of racial slaughter by other settler colonial regimes in history. Mr. President, over 18,000 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed, another 42,000 wounded, and more than 1.8 million people, over 80% of Gaza's population, have been driven from their homes. Thousands are missing, buried under the rubble. And yet Israel is not deterred. Is this any form of legitimate self-defense when you can kill 18,000 civilians with impunity and enjoy the protection in the Security Council against action? Therefore, I would appeal to all the membership to see this one-sided slaughter that is taking place. If Hamas is named and not Israel, you will provide a justification to the Israeli war machine to continue its roulette wheel of death. I believe that this is not the intention of the membership of the United Nations, to justify, to give a justification for the genocide that is taking place. I would therefore, on behalf of my delegation, on behalf of all the Arab countries, on behalf of the OIC, appeal to all the membership to vote against the amendments proposed in L28 by Austria and L29 by the United States. In case these amendments are adopted, Pakistan will submit sub-amendments to these in order to restore balance, in order to name Israel as the perpetrator of the mass crimes that are taking place in Gaza today. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan, and I now call on the representative of Israel to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, again, we find ourselves about to vote upon yet another hypocritical resolution. Not only does this resolution fail to condemn Hamas for their crimes against humanity, it doesn't even mention Hamas at all. This is a resolution that will only prolong the death and destruction in the region. That is precisely what a ceasefire means. Colleagues, on October 6th, there was a ceasefire, and it was abruptly violated. Not by Israel, but by 3,000 Hamas Nazis who invaded my country, raping women, beheading babies, burning families alive, and deliberately exterminating innocent civilians like insects. What would your countries do if you were in Israel's shoes? Call for a ceasefire? What would Moscow do? Beijing? Istanbul? How would you respond? Everyone here knows exactly. On December 1st, there was another pause in place. And again, it was violently ended by Hamas ISIS, who refused to release women held hostage and continued to fire rockets and missiles on our town and cities. Hamas raped women, committed heinous acts of sexual violence, took women and girls hostage, and is not only refusing to release them, but is also refusing the Red Cross's access to them. There are no war crimes more heinous than the atrocities Hamas committed, and those that support this resolution are giving the terrorists a free pass. A ceasefire means one thing and one thing only: ensuring the survival of Hamas, ensuring the survival of genocidal terrorists committed to the annihilation of Israel and Jews. This is no secret. Hamas's charter makes this clear, and Hamas leaders have publicly stated that October 7th was just a rehearsal. They have declared that they will repeat their atrocities again and again until Israel ceases to exist. So why would anyone want to aid Hamas in continuing their rule of terror and actualizing their satanic agenda? We all know that the so-called humanitarian ceasefire in this resolution has nothing to do with humanity. Israel is already taking every measure to facilitate the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Thousands of aid trucks have entered with tens of thousands of tons of humanitarian aid. Field hospitals have been constructed. Floating hospital ships have been docked. And the only reason more aid is not entering Gaza is because UN bodies refuse to solve the logistical difficulties preventing all aid trucks waiting in Rafah from entering. If this resolution's true intent was humanitarian aid, it would be focused on improving the UN's logistical capabilities, not on a ceasefire. A ceasefire will only benefit the terrorists that steal the humanitarian aid for themselves. It will not benefit the people of Gaza. Is this your solution? What will happen the day after the ceasefire? Will this bring peace and stability to the region? Of course not. A ceasefire is a death sentence for countless more Israelis and Gazans. By voting in favor of this resolution, you are supporting the survival of jihadist terror and the continued suffering of people of Gaza. The exploitation of the Palestinians has made the UN a moral stain on humanity. Why are you continuing to allow them to make the United Nations irrelevant? If this body's intentions are just, why don't you just start by demanding a ceasefire only from those responsible for violating the past too? Why don't you hold the rapists and child murderers accountable? The time has come to put the blame where it belongs, on the shoulders of the Hamas monsters. But this resolution does not even condemn Hamas. It doesn't even mention Hamas. I honestly don't know how can someone look in the mirror and support a resolution that doesn't condemn Hamas and doesn't even mention Hamas by name. So at the very last, I urge you to vote for adding a condemnation of Hamas to the resolution. But you know what? I have an idea. If you want a real ceasefire, here is the right address. This is the phone number of Hamas's office in Gaza. You can all call +970 599 3765 and ask for Yihya Sinwar. Tell Hamas to put down their arms, turn themselves in, and return our hostages. This will bring a complete ceasefire that will last forever. So why are you not doing this? Why are you not holding Hamas accountable? Ironically, today is the United Nations International Day of Neutrality, the day on which the UN reminds itself to be an impartial mediator in de-escalating conflict. Ignoring the war crimes of genocidal terrorists on today of all days, this body further proves its utter irrelevance. What a disgrace. But this resolution's absurdity goes further than protecting genocidal terrorists. This resolution is a written paradox. On the one hand, it calls for a ceasefire. Yet, on the other hand, it calls for the release of all hostages, all. Have you forgotten who you are dealing with? Have you forgotten that Hamas, the terror organization holding the hostages, has zero respect for international law? A useless resolution will not secure the release of hostages. In fact, Mr. President, a ceasefire will only ensure that their suffering is extended at the hands of the terrorists. Hamas does not respond to General Assembly resolutions. Hamas responds only to threats on its survival. Continuing Israel's operation in Gaza is the only way any hostages will be released. This disgraceful resolution serves only one purpose: to try to tie Israel's hands and allow Hamas to continue its reign of terror. Colleagues, this institution was founded in the wake of the Holocaust. It was established to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. But by supporting this resolution, you are doing exactly the opposite. You are voting in favor of a genocidal jihadist organization. Mr. President, unlike our enemies, Israel believes in life and peace, not brazen violence. No piece of paper, especially one that is adopted by a biased, politicized majority, will prevent Israel from defending itself against those that seek our destruction. Israel is fighting a war for her future. There is not a single member state here, that would act differently in a similar situation. A ceasefire only serves to prolong Hamas's reign of terror, so I urge all member states to vote against this resolution. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the State of Israel for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of South Africa on behalf of the African states.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am delivering the statement, explanation of vote before the vote on behalf of my country, South Africa. We thank you for convening this emergency special session of the United Nations General Assembly, which has been called because of yet another failure of the Security Council to fulfill its mandate. We thank the Arab Group and the OIC respectively for requesting the resumption of the 10th emergency special session of the General Assembly. On 6 December, the Secretary General took the initiative to invoke Article 99 of the UN Charter, bringing to the attention of the Security Council a matter which, in his opinion, may aggravate existing threats to the maintenance of international peace and security. South Africa commends the Secretary General for taking this initiative, and we remain steadfast in calling for an immediate, comprehensive ceasefire to assess the needs on the ground, allowing for the full opening of all humanitarian corridors to grant much-needed aid and basic services to reach those in need. We therefore emphasize the urgent implementation of General Assembly resolutions to realize this and alleviate the suffering of Palestinians in desperate need of relief aid. The Secretary General's initiative was necessary in the context of the inability of the Council to, at the very least, call for a humanitarian ceasefire. The international institutions created at the end of the Second World War, including the United Nations, human rights instruments, and judicial mechanisms, were established so that history would not repeat the cruelty experienced during the war. Yet, by failure to act, to call for an end to the loss of civilian life, it has become clear that there is a selective application of the international instruments and the utilization of some of these mechanisms for attaining narrow interests. This has resulted in calling to questions the effectiveness of the system. As members of the General Assembly, this emergency special session presents an opportunity for us to illustrate that the organization that was created to give hope for peace is not tone deaf to the suffering of the most vulnerable. The ESS is an opportunity for us to illustrate that we are able to take on the responsibility entrusted to us by the UN Charter and international law, and call for an immediate ceasefire and not condone war in the name of self-defense. The events of the past 6 weeks in Gaza have illustrated that Israel is acting contrary to its obligation in terms of the Genocide Convention. As a UN member state, and owing to South Africa's painful past experience of a system of apartheid, this impresses on us as member states to take action in accordance with international law. Mr. President, an issue we cannot also ignore is the failure of member states of this organization to abide by the decision taken on 27 October 2023. South Africa was among more than 2/3 of the member states that called for an immediate ceasefire at the General Assembly. This has been ignored. We cannot proclaim the importance of international law and the importance of the UN Charter in some situations and not in others, as if the rule of law only applies to a select few. For international law and our moral obligations to be credible, it should be uniformly applied and not be selective. We have all signed the Charter. Let us commit to and respect decisions taken in accordance with the Charter. Mr. President, the lack of meaningful action from the United Nations indicates that more than ever before, reform of the system of global governance so that it is fair, equitable, and has the capacity to respond to the needs of all persons in situations of threat and harm is urgently needed. The system that is needed should not just be a tool for the most powerful countries of the world, but one that provides protection for the most vulnerable. The inadequacy of the UN Security Council, which has a mandate derived from the UN Charter for the maintenance of international peace and security, has become glaring. The Security Council, due to aggravated politicization, has not at the very least been able to call for a humanitarian ceasefire to allow for much needed humanitarian supplies to go to those that need it the most. This once again demonstrates the urgent need for the reform of this body. Mr. President, South Africa supports the G8 draft resolution L27 being considered this afternoon, protection of civilians and upholding legal and humanitarian obligations. I thank you.
We have heard the last speaker in explanation of vote before the vote. Before proceeding to take a decision on draft resolution, I wish to address the question concerning the majority required for the adoption of the draft resolution. In light of Article 18, paragraphs 2 and 3 of the Charter of the United Nations, is there any objection to taking action on draft resolution A/ES10/L27 by a 2/3 majority of the members present and voting? I see no objection. The 2/3 majority of members present and voting is therefore required for the adoption of the draft resolution. The 2/3 majority of members present and voting is therefore also required for the adoption of the amendments to the draft resolution. Before we proceed to take a decision on draft resolution A/ES10/L27, in accordance with Rule 90 of the Rules of Procedure, the Assembly shall first take a decision on draft amendments A/ES10/L28 and A/ES10/L29 one by one. We now turn to draft amendment A/ES10/L28. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft amendment A/ES10/L28, please signify. Those against and abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft amendment A/ES10/L28. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are correctly reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. $89 in favor, 61 against, and 20 abstentions. Having failed to obtain the required two-thirds majority, draft amendment A/ES10/L28 is not adopted. We now turn to draft amendment A/ES10/L29. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft amendment A/ES10/L29, please signify. Those against and abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft amendment A/ES10/L29. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are correctly reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. 84 in favor, 62 against, 25 abstentions. Having failed to obtain the required two-thirds majority, draft amendment A/ES10/L29 is not adopted. Since draft amendments A/ES10/L28 and A/ES10/L29 were not adopted, we shall proceed to take action on draft resolution A/ES10/L27. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/ES10/L27 entitled Protection of Civilians and upholding legal and humanitarian obligations. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/ES10/L27, please signify. Those against, and abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES10/L27 entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are correctly reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. And please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows: 153 in favor, 10 against, 23 abstentions. Draft resolution A/ES10/L27 has been adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to the representative of Belgium.
Monsieur le Président, le second secrétaire général de cette organisation, M. Dag Hammarskjöld, a un jour affirmé que l'Organisation des Nations Unies n'avait pas été créée pour nous amener au paradis, mais bien pour nous éviter de tomber en enfer. C'est pourtant malheureusement ce que la population de Gaza attend de nous aujourd'hui. Collègues, c'est dans le respect de l'esprit insufflé par le secrétaire général lorsqu'il a invoqué l'article 99 de la Charte des Nations Unies que la Belgique a voté aujourd'hui en faveur du projet de résolution qui nous a été présenté. Si vous me le permettez, je me concentrerai sur 3 points. Premièrement, ce vote en faveur de la protection des civils et du droit international, en ce compris le droit international humanitaire, est un appel ferme à contrer le risque d'implosion de l'espace humanitaire à Gaza. C'est à cette fin que la Belgique se joint à la majorité des membres de cette organisation qui soutient l'instauration immédiate d'un cessez-le-feu humanitaire pouvant à terme mener à la fin des hostilités. La Belgique se joint également à ceux, encore plus nombreux, qui demandent tant la libération immédiate et sans condition de tous les otages que l'accès humanitaire immédiat et sans entrave. Le travail des agences onusiennes doit par ailleurs être facilité, les infrastructures vitales restaurées. Nous plaidons pour l'ouverture continue du point de passage de Kerem Shalom afin de faciliter et d'accélérer le ravitaillement vital. Il doit être mis fin à toute entrave délibérée de l'acheminement de l'aide aux civils. Deuxièmement, mes chers collègues, ces considérations humanitaires ne doivent pas être interprétées comme un appel à la fin de la lutte contre le Hamas et autres groupes terroristes. La solution ne viendra pas des extrémistes et autres ennemis de la paix. Les actions de ceux-ci augmentent le risque de débordement du conflit en Cisjordanie et dans la région. Il doit y être mis fin. La Belgique soutient à ce titre la reddition des comptes et appuie l'adoption de mesures coercitives à l'égard des terroristes, comme celle adoptée ce vendredi 8 décembre par l'Union européenne contre des cadres du Hamas, mais également à l'égard des extrémistes violents. La Belgique a soutenu l'amendement américain dans cette optique, en espérant que son adoption nous permette de franchir une étape importante ici à New York. Mes chers collègues, il nous revient désormais de contribuer, c'est mon 3e point, collectivement à la création d'un environnement propice à la recherche d'une solution négociée à la question palestinienne. un environnement permettant de dégager un horizon politique qui aboutira à une solution à 2 États. La Belgique soutiendra les acteurs constructifs dont l'action nous rapprochera de cet objectif. La Belgique appuie à cette fin l'organisation en temps voulu d'une conférence internationale pour la paix. C'est également tout le sens de l'effort pour la journée de la paix, Peace Day Effort, porté conjointement par l'Union européenne et par la Ligue des États arabes. Mes chers collègues, nous devons agir collectivement sur le court terme en donnant forme à un cessez-le-feu humanitaire, sur le moyen terme en mettant fin aux agissements des terroristes et des extrémistes violents, et sur le long terme en travaillant à une solution durable de ce conflit qui garantisse à Israël la possibilité de vivre en paix et en sécurité et qui réalise enfin le droit à l'autodétermination du peuple palestinien. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Belgium and invite now the representative of Saudi Arabia to take the podium.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيد الرئيس، صوت وفد بلادي لصالح القرار المقدم هذا اليوم أملا في إنهاء هذه الظروف والمعاناة المأساوية التي يواجهها الشعب الفلسطيني جراء حملة عسكرية دموية عديمة الإنسانية من قبل قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلية. السيد الرئيس، اسمحوا لي في البداية أن أتوجه لكم بالشكر على استجابتكم لاستئناف الدورة الطارئة الاستثنائية العاشرة للجمعية العامة التي تنعقد إثر فشل مجلس الأمن مجددا في إصدار قرار لإيقاف إطلاق النار في غزة، حيث نجتمع هنا للمرة الثانية تحت هذه القبة في ظل ظروف أصعب وأكثر ألماً في الوقت الذي لا تزال فيه حملة القتل والتهجير الشرسة مستمرة، ولا تزال انتهاكات المواثيق والقرارات الشرعية الدولية والمبادئ الإنسانية مستمرة، في ظل عجز مجلس الأمن عن اتخاذ أي إجراءات رادعة أمام هذه الحملة وتلك الانتهاكات، وسط غياب تام لآليات المحاسبة الدولية، حيث يطال القصف يوميا كل مكان في غزة من مستشفيات ومدارس وبنى تحتية ومجمعات سكنية، مخلفا وراءه الدمار ومسقطا آلاف الضحايا المدنيين من أطفال ونساء وشيوخ. فقد وصل مجموع الضحايا المدنيين في غزة إلى أكثر من 18,000 شهيد، معظمهم من الأطفال والنساء، مما يفاقم الأزمة الإنسانية الكارثية في غزة يوما بعد يوم، ويبرهن على فشل المجتمع الدولي في وقف هذه الكارثة. وتؤكد بلادي أن هذه الأوضاع الإنسانية الخطيرة الناجمة عن التصعيد المستمر لا يمكن تبريرها مطلقا، وأن حقن الدماء وحماية المدنيين ووقف العمليات العسكرية هي أولويات ملحة لا يمكن قبول أي تسويف أو تعطيل لها، وأن عدم الاكتراث الفوري بها سيفاقم الكارثة الإنسانية الكبرى والتي يتحمل مسؤوليتها الاحتلال الإسرائيلي والمجتمع الدولي. السيدات والسادة، لقد صدر عن القمة العربية الإسلامية المشتركة غير العادية التي استضافتها الرياض في 11 من نوفمبر بحضور قادة دول وحكومات الدول الأعضاء في جامعة الدول العربية ومنظمة التعاون الإسلامي قرارات تمثل إرادة الشعوب العربية والإسلامية تسعى لحقن الدماء وإيصال المساعدات دون قيود وإيقاف الانتهاكات وتجاوز الأزمة والمعاناة غير المبررة في فلسطين، والوقوف بجانب الشعب الفلسطيني لتحقيق مطالبه المشروعة باستعادة أراضيه المحتلة وإقامة دولته المستقلة، ومطالبة المجتمع الدولي ومؤسساته للقيام بمسؤولياته تجاه تحقيق ذلك دون تعطيل. إن الكارثة الإنسانية والأحداث المأساوية الجارية في فلسطين تحتم علينا التحرك لوضع حد فوري لإيقاف العمليات العسكرية وتوفير الحماية المدنية وإطلاق سراح الرهائن والأسرى امتثالا للأعراف والقوانين الدولية ومبادئنا الإنسانية المشتركة، وإيجاد حل سلمي لهذه الأزمة يخرج المنطقة من دوامة العنف المتكررة السيد الرئيس، في ظل تردد بعض أعضاء المجتمع الدولي عن دعم الدعوة لوقف إطلاق النار وإدخال المساعدات الإنسانية الكافية، فإننا نعرب عن استيائنا من ازدواجية المعايير والانتقائية تجاه الأزمة، ونعرب عن أسفنا العميق من تردد البعض تجاه دعم حق الشعب الفلسطيني في التمتع بحياة كريمة. وهنا نجدد النداء بضرورة وقف إطلاق النار وحقن الدماء، وندين استهداف المدنيين ومحاولات التهجير القسري وسياسة العقاب الجماعي بحق سكان غزة. وتؤكد بلادي على أولوياتها دوما للعمل نحو السلام والدعوة للالتزام بما تقتضيه المواثيق والقوانين الدولية. وإذ نعتبر أن الأزمة الحالية هي نتاج تقاعس المجتمع الدولي عن إنهاء الاحتلال وإنفاذ حل الدولتين، وأن السكوت عن الممارسات الإسرائيلية غير الشرعية على مدار 70 عاماً هي ما أوصلت المنطقة إلى الأزمة الحالية، فإننا ندعو المجتمع الدولي للاطلاع بمسؤولياته للوقف الفوري لهذه الحرب حقناً للدماء، ونؤكد على ضرورة الوصول إلى حل شامل وعادل للقضية الفلسطينية وفقاً لمبادرة السلام العربية وحل الدولتين وإقامة دولة فلسطينية عاصمتها القدس. وفي الختام نشكر كل من دعم مشروع القرار الذي تم اعتماده بأغلبية كبيرة جداً، وهذا يعكس موقفاً دولياً يقضي بإلزام ذلك القرار وضرورة تطبيقه فوراً. وشكراً السيد الرئيس.
I thank the representative of Saudi Arabia, and I now invite the representative of India to take the floor.
Mr. President, India has voted in favor of the resolution just adopted by the General Assembly. The situation that this august body has been deliberating upon has many dimensions. There is the terrorist attack in Israel on 7 October and the concern for the hostages taken at that time. There is an enormous humanitarian crisis and the large-scale loss of civilian lives, especially of women and children. There is the issue of observing international humanitarian law in all circumstances. And there is the endeavor to find a peaceful and lasting two-state solution to the long-standing Palestine question. Our challenge in this extraordinarily difficult time is to strike the right balance. The gravity and complexity of what the international community faces is underlined by the Secretary-General invoking Article 99 of the Charter of the United Nations. We therefore welcome the fact that the international community has been able to find a common ground to address the multiple challenges facing the region right now. Thank you.
I thank the representative of India, and I now give the floor to the representative of Bulgaria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Bulgaria is gravely alarmed by the catastrophic situation of civilians in Gaza and reiterates its call for continued rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access and aid to reach those in need through all necessary measures. We underline the utmost importance of ensuring the protection of all civilians at all times in line with international humanitarian law and deplore all loss of civilian life. Every lost life is one too many. However, we must also recognize that the heinous and indiscriminate terrorist attacks of Hamas across Israel, which we condemn in the strongest terms, brought unimaginable suffering of civilians. There is no justification for terror, and Israel has the inherent right to defend itself in accordance with international law and international humanitarian law. Unfortunately, the resolution that was just adopted falls short of recognizing that, and for those reasons, Bulgaria had to abstain on it. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Bulgaria and now invite the representative of Germany to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We would like to thank all member states involved, Egypt in particular, for their work in this very important issue and for keeping the humanitarian situation in Gaza in our joint focus. We support the objective of the resolution to reduce violence and human suffering and to enable unhindered humanitarian access. We are saddened by every life that has been lost in this conflict and express our condolences to all victims and their families, Israeli, Palestinian, and UN staff. Nevertheless, we cannot endorse a text which does not condemn the heinous acts of terror and violations of international humanitarian law committed by Hamas against Israel since October 7th, including the horrific acts of sexual violence against Israeli women and girls. We condemn these acts in the strongest possible terms, and so should all member states. It has been more than 2 months that Hamas continues to attack Israel with rockets on a daily basis and uses Palestinian civilians as human shields. We reiterate our call on Hamas and others to immediately release all remaining hostages and lay down their weapons. We commend efforts undertaken by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt to secure the release of hostages. Mr. President, how can we possibly demand a humanitarian ceasefire while attacks by Hamas continue? Israel has a right to defend itself in accordance with international law and international humanitarian law. At the same time, we will continue to call for humanitarian pauses and unhindered humanitarian access so that assistance can reach those in need. Civilians need to be protected during conflict. It breaks our hearts to witness the immense suffering of the Palestinian population, especially women and children. Germany supports the UN Secretary General's efforts to act to mitigate a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza and the collapse of the humanitarian system. We will continue to do our utmost to help alleviate the suffering of the civilian population in Gaza, including by supporting humanitarian relief efforts. We will remain committed to supporting the Palestinian people now and in the future. Mr. President, we regret that the resolution before us does not acknowledge Hamas' primary responsibility for starting this terrible conflict with its horrific attack on 7th of October. It is against this backdrop that Germany abstained in today's vote. Mr. President, in the UN we speak the language of international law, of humanity, of peaceful coexistence. This is what unites us. We all must step our efforts to work towards a meaningful peace process, allowing both Israelis and Palestinians to live side by side in peace and security in 2 independent states and in secure borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany, and I now invite the Republic of Korea to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of Korea voted in favor of the amendment proposed by Austria, as the language clarifies Hamas and other groups that are holding the hostages. We also voted in favor of the amendment proposed by the United States, as the language clearly condemns the terrorist attacks by Hamas on the 7th of October and the taking of hostages. Thanks to the testimonies by hostages released during the recent 7-day pause, we learned more details about the horrific terrorist attacks by Hamas. We once again condemn in the strongest terms the heinous terrorist attacks by Hamas against Israel and urge immediate release of all the remaining hostages. We believe that Israel has the right and the duty to protect itself and its citizens. But irrespective of nationality, gender, age, ethnicity, or faith, all civilians must be protected. We urge all parties to take measures to protect civilians in accordance with their obligations under the international humanitarian law. Therefore, we voted in favor of the resolution proposed by Egypt, considering that an extended humanitarian pause that can be durably maintained is essential to save the lives of Palestinian civilians and hostages in Gaza. The current humanitarian situation is calamitous, and we need time to save civilian lives and guarantee full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access for civilians in Gaza. Far too many civilian lives have been lost, and those alive are also suffering from the lack of requisite humanitarian assistance and essential services. The cessation of hostilities is also needed to facilitate the release of all the remaining hostages held in Gaza. Mr. President, this vicious cycle in the Middle East must stop, and now is the time to redouble our efforts to realize the two-state solution. Sustainable peace in the region can only be achieved through sincere negotiations based on the two-state solution, with both Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders consistent with international law and relevant UN resolutions. We hope the UN can speak with one voice to this end. As an incoming Security Council member, the Republic of Korea is determined to help achieve the common aspiration of the world for peace in the Middle East. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of South Korea, and now I invite the representative of Cyprus to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. This emergency special session has been called due to the alarming humanitarian situation in Gaza. Mr. President, we unequivocally reject and condemn the inconceivable terrorist attacks by Hamas that commenced on 7th October, as well as the deplorable taking of hostages. We demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held, as well as ensuring immediate humanitarian access to them. To this end, we supported the respective amendments because this crisis was not born in a vacuum. We deeply regret that these amendments did not pass. Mr. President, the end of November humanitarian pause allowed for the release of some of the hostages held by Hamas and other terrorist groups, and for greater loads of emergency relief to enter into Gaza. However, many of the hostages still remain captive, and the colossal humanitarian needs in Gaza are increasing by the hour. It is for this reason that we voted in favor of this resolution. Palestinian and Israeli civilians must be protected in accordance with international humanitarian law. International law, including international humanitarian law, must be fully respected. We are also working with partners towards ensuring humanitarian assistance enter Gaza via a dedicated one-way maritime corridor. Given the gravity of the humanitarian crisis, we hope to complement current routes primarily through Rafah to assist in alleviating the suffering. Mr. President, ultimately, the only way forward is reviving the Middle East peace process on the basis of a two-state solution in line with the UN resolutions. We stand ready to support this aim as it is the only way to ensure conditions of sustainable security and stability equally for Israelis and Palestinians alike, and it is a crucial step towards fostering stability in the Middle East as a whole. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Cyprus, and I now invite the representative of Australia to take the floor.
Mr. President, Australia appreciates the Arab group bringing forward this resolution. Australia is gravely concerned about the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. Human suffering is widespread and unacceptable. Civilians who fled northern Gaza are now being pushed further south, and as the conflict spreads south, there are increasingly few safe spaces to go. The world has witnessed a harrowing number of civilian deaths, including children. This must not continue. Australia again calls for safe, unimpeded and sustained humanitarian access in Gaza and safe passage for civilians. We acknowledge the gravity of the Secretary-General's invoking Article 99. Australia welcomed the humanitarian pause agreed by the parties in November and brokered by the United States, Egypt and Qatar. This resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, is the world urging these pauses be resumed so urgent humanitarian aid can flow. Australia is part of that call, and we support this resolution. We see such pauses as critical steps on a path to a sustainable and permanent ceasefire. But such a ceasefire cannot be one-sided. Australia also supported the amendments proposed by Austria and the United States because we believe this resolution should have gone further by unequivocally condemning Hamas as the perpetrators of the 7 October attack on innocent Israeli civilians. That terrorist attack precipitated this crisis. This critical fact should be clearly recorded in this place. Australia unequivocally condemns the ongoing acts of terror by Hamas, its use of human shields, and its use of civilian infrastructure to launch attacks on Israel. Australia reiterates our demand for Hamas to release all remaining hostages immediately and unconditionally. In defending itself, Israel must respect international law, including international humanitarian law. Civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, must be protected. Hamas must be defeated and dismantled, but this cannot be without account for the protection and welfare of Palestinian civilians. President, Australia supports Palestinians' right to self-determination. There must not be forced displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, physical reoccupation of Gaza, any reduction in territory, or any use of siege or blockade. And Gaza must never again be used as a platform for terrorism. We reaffirm that settlements are illegal under international law and a serious obstacle to lasting peace. And we recommit ourselves to working with any sincere partner toward that just and enduring peace in the form of a two-state solution where Israelis and Palestinians can live securely within internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Australia, and I now invite the representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank you for reconvening this emergency special session. I also wish to take this opportunity to express our unwavering support for the Secretary General of the United Nations. We take his call on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, including his decision to invoke Article 99 of the UN Charter, very seriously. The current situation in Gaza is horrendous. Too many innocent lives have been taken. The scale of suffering and destruction in Gaza due to Israel's bombardments is heart-wrenching. Medical facilities are under extreme duress. The collective suffering of the people in Gaza, among which many children, should stop. We mourn the loss of lives of all civilians, including journalists, UN personnel, humanitarian workers, and medical staff. Our thoughts are with their loved ones. Urgent and immediate action is needed to halt the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. 80% of the population is internally displaced. There is no effective protection for civilians, and they have nowhere to go. No place in Gaza is safe now. The humanitarian system is on the verge of collapse, with the risk of starvation and outbreak of infectious diseases. The resolution contains important messages in this regard, as well as the essential demand to release all hostages. Therefore, we worked hard to reach an agreement on the text that would enable a vote in favor of this resolution. However, the lack of clarity on the temporary nature of a humanitarian ceasefire in the text creates confusion. We tried to change the text accordingly, but our proposals were unfortunately not accepted as the text was not open for further negotiations. The resolution further lacks reference to the heinous acts by Hamas. Based on these considerations, the Kingdom of the Netherlands abstained on the resolution. Mr. President, The harsh reality is that attacks from Hamas and elsewhere in the region continue. Case in point are the repeated Houthi missile attacks targeting Israel and vessels in the Red Sea. Israel's continued need to defend itself against continuous attacks therefore still stands with respect for international humanitarian law. The Kingdom of the Netherlands remains shocked at the heinous terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on October 7th, and we condemn it in the strongest possible terms. The spiral of violence that followed has seen too many civilian casualties. It is of the essence that both parties do everything to ensure that civilians are protected in line with international humanitarian law. We need to see more urgent action. Mr. President, the way Israel implements self-defense matters. We consistently and explicitly urge Israel to demonstrate restraint, and we consistently stress the importance of proportionality and necessity in its current operations. In that light, we expect of Israel, one, that it does everything to ensure that civilians are protected. This is an obligation and a necessity. Two, to ensure that direct and unhindered humanitarian assistance gets to the people of Gaza. This is an obligation under international law. Now that the fighting has resumed and needs in Gaza are escalating, decreasing aid influx is unacceptable. The decision to open Kerem Shalom for the inspection of humanitarian aid trucks is a much-needed step in the right direction, but much more is needed. Aid needs to pass through, including fuel and medical supplies. These goods also need to reach all those in need in Gaza. Three, and we expect Israel to ensure that humanitarian workers are able to work in Gaza safely and without constraints. This is also an obligation under international law. Four, we also reiterate that settler violence is completely unacceptable. Under occupation law, the IDF has an obligation to actively protect Palestinian civilians from violence. Israel needs to act decisively and urgently to stop the settler violence and illegal annexations in the West Bank, which further destabilizes the situation in the region. In this context, we urgently call for immediate, new, substantial, frequent humanitarian pauses. The ending of suffering of innocent people is an obligation. This conflict needs a political solution in accordance with international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and I now invite the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran to take the floor.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Mr. President, the situation before us is quite clear. One member state, a permanent member of Security Council, misusing its unequal authority of veto power and in clear disregard to the united will of international community, has decided to stand with Israeli criminal regime and materially enable this regime in its ongoing massacre against civilians in Gaza. The United States blatantly opposing a ceasefire, which means prescribing war, violence, and eventually more death for children and women in Gaza. As highlighted by Secretary General in his recent briefing before the Security Council, no place in Gaza is safe, and there is an imminent risk of a total collapse of the humanitarian support system. The Secretary General, using his authority under Article 99 of the United Nations Charter, has urgently called upon the Security Council to intervene and bring a halt to the Israeli regime's attack in Gaza. This call received full support from the international community. The United Nations Charter initially predicted the power of veto as a tool to maintain and ensure international peace and security. However, today, this authority is frequently abused to obstruct the very establishment of peace and security. This trend is a clear alarm, signaling the imperative need to eliminate such discriminatory practices. Mr. President, over the past 2 months, we have witnessed a violent act of aggression carried out by Israeli armed forces in Gaza Strip, resulting in the death of more than 18,000 Palestinian civilians. The situation on ground entails all risk factors for genocide and definition under Article 2 of Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which bear responsibility for all member states to impede and prevent its occurrence. This regime had been pursuing a scorched earth policy by deliberately destroying infrastructure and residential buildings in manner that there is no place to live in the Gaza. These barbaric crimes must be addressed by international community in a decisive manner, and Palestinians must be protected internationally. Considering the major failure of the Security Council in addressing the situation in ground, we remind responsibility of all member states on the international law regarding the need to prevent genocide and war crimes, and reiterate our call for regional and national measures that in any practical way could hinder the violence and deal with the current situation. In conclusion, my delegation has voted in favor of resolution considering the urgency of the situation and a strong need to address the dire humanitarian condition in Palestine, and would like to put on record that our support for the resolution is without prejudice to our long-standing and constant national position on issues related to the question of Palestine and non-recognition of the Israeli regime. Today's vote by the General Assembly is a victory for blood of brave martyrs of the Gaza over the Israelis' war machine, and clearly indicate international will. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Islamic Republic of Iran. I now give a floor to distinguished representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Slovenia co-sponsored the resolution presented in the Security Council, and we followed suit today in the General Assembly. We voted in favor of the resolution, and we also supported the amendments which, in our view, would contribute to more accurately reflecting the complex situation on the ground. Mr. President, it has been more than 2 months of human suffering, physical destruction, and collective trauma across Israel and the occupied territory. Words seem to have been said in vain as we continue to observe one of the darkest hours for this organization unfolding in front of our eyes. I would like to focus on 3 elements which brought us here today: the letter by the Secretary General, the letter by UNRWA Commissioner General, and the veto cast in the Security Council. Firstly, I wish to express our firm support to the Secretary General and the United Nations in their efforts to prevent further deterioration of an already dire situation on the ground. The scale of killing, suffering, and destruction reported have been a clear testament that at this stage only one step is sufficient: a declaration of a humanitarian ceasefire. Let us be clear. There can be no justification for the brutal terrorist attack of Hamas on Israel, and we strongly condemn it, including reported sexual violence. We repeat our call for immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. What we are witnessing in Gaza are clear violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. We remain appalled by reports of attacks on civilians and on schools, hospitals, UN facilities, and other civilian objects, and a high number of civilian casualties. People do not have access to the most basic provisions needed for survival. There is an increased risk of a breakdown of public order. Almost 2 million people have been displaced. Any further mass displacements should be prevented. Slovenia remains concerned over the escalation of settler violence in the West Bank and the announced additional expansions of illegal settlements. Settlement activities are illegal, erode the viability of the two-state solution, and undermine the prospect for a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. We are deeply worried about the spillover and increased potential for the destabilization of the wider region, and we call for restraint. Secondly, we would like to express our deepest concern over the situation of UNRWA, its severely limited ability to implement its mandate, and the circumstances in which the humanitarian community is working on the ground. Many of the humanitarian workers have been displaced and are themselves in need of humanitarian assistance. People serving humanity have been failed by humanity. UNRWA represents a glimmer of hope to thousands of Gazans and to thousands more in the West Bank and the neighboring countries. Its potential collapse would mean humanitarian assistance in Gaza would no longer be possible at a scale that is needed. Slovenia commends the work of humanitarian agencies and their personnel in Gaza, who continue to provide assistance and protection to the people, often at a great sacrifice, paying the ultimate price with their own lives. We express our condolences over the high number of victims among the UNRWA staff. Thirdly, we deeply regret the inability of the UN Security Council to address this situation. While recognizing efforts of many countries engaging in diplomacy on the ground and commending the adoption of the Resolution 2712, we must note that the Secretary General has clearly stated that current conditions are making it impossible for meaningful humanitarian support on the ground. The Security Council should therefore step in and support rapid, sustained, unimpeded, and safe access for humanitarian aid, equipment, and personnel to Gaza and its distribution within Gaza. This can only be done by a humanitarian ceasefire that will lead to a truly permanent ceasefire. This brings us to the need for a resumption of a meaningful political process, which will lead to the two-state solution, with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. Slovenia has and will continue to support initiatives that reinforce the Middle East peace process. We therefore strongly support the organization of a peace conference as soon as possible. To conclude, we would like to thank both the Secretary General and the UNRWA Commissioner General and many other parts of the UN system for conveying clear messages to the membership. Never again is now. And this is why Slovenia clearly supports the call for a humanitarian ceasefire. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Slovenia. I now give a floor to distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Thank you, Mr. President. New Zealand welcomes the adoption of today's resolution. In relation to the amendments put forward by the United States and Austria, we wish to register our disappointment that they did not pass. The amendments would have introduced elements which New Zealand felt would have benefited the resolution and which remain important to New Zealand's position on this terrible conflict. New Zealand has consistently acknowledged Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas's terrorist attacks. We unequivocally condemn these attacks and reiterate that all remaining hostages being held by Hamas must be released immediately and unconditionally. In defending itself, Israel must respect international law, including international humanitarian law. Civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, must be protected. New Zealand is gravely concerned about the impact of this conflict on civilians. The loss of life and level of suffering in Gaza is utterly devastating. Over 1 million people with nowhere to go, outbreaks of disease, and overwhelming challenges with nutrition, sanitation, and overcrowding. There is simply not enough water, food, fuel, and shelter. Critical humanitarian assistance must get to those who need it. The sick and injured must be cared for without risk of attack. The basics for survival must not be used or withheld as weapons of war. We thank the Secretary General and the United Nations and humanitarian staff for their leadership, especially those working on the ground in enormously difficult circumstances and under significant constraints. We are distressed that the effective delivery of humanitarian aid in Gaza is now almost impossible. Ensuring meaningful humanitarian access is critical. It is a key requirement of international humanitarian law, particularly the Fourth Geneva Convention. We call on Israel to facilitate the necessary access immediately to alleviate the plight of civilians in Gaza. Last week, the Secretary-General sounded the loudest possible alarm over this crisis. We must answer his call. It was for this reason, the urgent need for the provision of critical life-saving assistance, that New Zealand co-sponsored the United Arab Emirates Security Council resolution, which called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. We are deeply disappointed that the casting of a veto yet again prevented the Security Council from agreeing on a response to a pressing crisis. The General Assembly has, once again, had to take action where the Security Council has failed to do so. In this Assembly, in late October, New Zealand joined 120 member states in voting for a resolution that called for an immediate, durable and sustained humanitarian truce to facilitate the delivery of aid. Today's General Assembly resolution has the same objective: the fighting to stop and civilians to be protected. Therefore, New Zealand once again supported this call and voted for this resolution. At the same time as we push for a humanitarian ceasefire, we urge all parties involved in the conflict, as well as countries with influence in the region, to take urgent steps towards establishing a sustainable ceasefire. A lasting solution to the conflict will only be achieved by peaceful means. Revival of the Middle East peace process is critical. There is no military solution to this conflict, just as there is no role for Hamas in the future governance of Gaza. Mr. President, 2 final points. New Zealand condemns settlement building and expansion in the West Bank, which is illegal under international law, and condemns the violence being perpetrated by settlers. We call for Israel to address this urgently. New Zealand also urges governments in the region to do all they can to ensure this conflict does not spill over into the wider region. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of New Zealand. I now give the floor to a distinguished representative of Czechia.
I thank you, Mr. President. And let me start by stating unequivocally that Czechia grieves for every civilian life lost in the ongoing conflict, and we will continue to do so. The humanitarian situation in Gaza deeply troubles us, and we appreciate the collective efforts to protect civilians and alleviate their suffering. To that end, we welcome most aspects of this General Assembly resolution as a genuine attempt to address the current situation in the Middle East. But in the context of this emergency special session, the primary task of the General Assembly is the maintenance of international peace and security. This is not possible without addressing not only the issues related to the legal framework for the conduct of war, but also the conditions under which states may resort to the use of force. Regrettably, this resolution fails to condemn the unspeakable atrocities committed by Hamas on the 7th of October. The events of that day leave no room for excuses or justifications. The horrific terrorist attack by Hamas resulted in the tragic loss of countless lives spanning various nationalities. Furthermore, we have all been appalled by the horrifying images depicting victims of sexual violence inflicted by Hamas terrorists. We are also of the opinion that calling for an immediate ceasefire ignores the grave threat that Hamas poses not only to Israel, but also to the Palestinian people. The harsh reality on the ground is that an immediate ceasefire would only leave Hamas in control, thereby significantly heightening the prospect of yet another devastating terrorist attack and human suffering. Let us also remember that the civilian death toll continues to rise due to Hamas's reprehensible practice of using civilian infrastructure and civilians as human shields. It is with this in mind that we believe that Israel needs to be able to exercise its right to defend itself, and it needs to do so in a manner that abides by international law and international humanitarian law. Mr. President, based on the reasons that I have just outlined, it is with a heavy heart that we decided to vote against this resolution. We appreciate the efforts by Austria and the United States to bring more balance to the text, and that is why we supported their amendments. Last but not least, let me reiterate my country's unwavering commitment to actively working towards a two-state solution. This is essential to achieving statehood for the Palestinian people, ensuring security for Israel, and peace for people on both sides. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Czechia. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Greece.
Mr. President, Greece expresses deep concern about the grave humanitarian situation in Gaza, where we are unfortunately witnessing a rapid deterioration of the conditions on the ground. High priority right now should be to address the humanitarian urgency so that sufficient aid can be delivered to the civilian population through safe passages and by means of humanitarian pauses. Humanitarian needs must be addressed so as to sustain Palestinians in Gaza, give them the prospect of reconstruction, and avoid forced displacement from Gaza. We remind Greece's principal position that Israel has the right to defend itself, while at the same time complying with international humanitarian law. We should not lose sight of the Hamas responsibility, its terrorist attack of October 7th, and its taking of Israeli hostages. We regret that the text does not condemn terrorism and does not mention that the hostages were taken and are held by Hamas. That is why we have co-sponsored the amendments proposed by Austria and US. We would have preferred a resolution that ideally reflected those elements. However, considering the present critical humanitarian circumstances, we have decided to vote and voted in favor of this resolution. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Greece. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Canada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. We mourn, like everyone in this assembly, every Israeli and Palestinian innocent life which has been lost in this conflict, and we express our profound condolences to all families and communities affected by the terrible violence. Canada continues to unequivocally condemn Hamas's brutal terrorist attacks against Israel on October the 7th, including the sexual and gender-based violence and the killing, the maiming, and the abduction of civilians. We also continue to call for the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages and demand that they be treated humanely in accordance with international law. We iterate the call for the facilitated departure of all foreign nationals in Gaza, including Canadians trying to leave Gaza. We recognize Israel's right to defend itself. In defending itself, Israel must respect international humanitarian law. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected. We are alarmed at the diminishing safe space for civilians in Gaza. The price of defeating Hamas cannot be the continuous suffering of Palestinian civilians. Canada remains deeply concerned by the humanitarian crisis and its severe impacts on Palestinian civilians, especially women and children. The ongoing humanitarian crisis has weighed heavily in Canada's decision to support this resolution. La récente pause dans les hostilités a permis la libération de plus de 100 otages et un meilleur accès humanitaire aux civils palestiniens touchés. Le Canada regrette que cette pause n'ait pas pu être prolongée et continue de demander que les Palestiniens de Gaza reçoivent le carburant, l'eau et l'aide humanitaire dont ils ont tant besoin. À cette fin, le Canada soutient le cessez-le-feu humanitaire mentionné dans cette résolution, car il s'agit d'une mesure nécessaire pour protéger les civils, permettre à une aide humanitaire beaucoup plus importante d'entrer dans la bande de Gaza et permettre aux ressortissants étrangers de quitter Gaza, y compris les Canadiens et Canadiennes. Hamas must release all hostages, stop using Palestinian civilians as human shields, stop intentionally occupying civilian sites for terrorist purposes, and lay down its weapons. We continue to support a clear statement from the General Assembly calling out the role of Hamas in the conflict, its taking of hostages, and its use of human shields. And one day we will get one. This is why we supported the amendments proposed by Austria and the United States to the resolution, and why we join Australia and New Zealand in saying that Hamas can have no future role in the governance of Gaza. Canada remains committed to the goal of a comprehensive, a just, and a lasting peace in the Middle East, including the creation of a Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with the State of Israel. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Canada. I now give a floor to distinguished representative of Iceland.
See how that flies.
In light of the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza, Iceland has chosen to co-sponsor and consequently vote in favor of the resolution presented by Egypt. Following a much-needed humanitarian pause, the resumption of hostilities has resulted in full-scale escalation of the conflict. Once again, innocent civilians trapped in unbearable conditions bear the brunt of this conflict, and the civilian death toll is unacceptable. However, we regret that the two proposed amendments presented by Austria and the United States, acknowledging the brutal and indiscriminate terrorist attack by Hamas on 7th of October and their leading part in the taking of hostages, were not passed. There can be no justification for terrorism. Recognizing Hamas's part in the ongoing conflict does not contradict our strong and urgent call for an immediate and sustained humanitarian ceasefire, full compliance with international law by all parties, protection of civilians, immediate release of hostages, and the timely and sufficient provision of humanitarian aid. Iceland supports the Secretary General's appeal for a decisive action by the Security Council invoking Article 99, and was one of the 102 UN member states that co-sponsored the draft resolution last Friday. The ongoing impasse in the Security Council is deeply regrettable. We call on Council members to redouble their efforts to avert further escalation and a collapse of the humanitarian system in Gaza. Mr. President, we deplore the immense suffering and unacceptable civilian death toll. We are alarmed by the impact of mass evacuations of civilians in Gaza. These need to stop. There is no safe place in Gaza. While increased flow of humanitarian aid through a second inspection point announced by Israel is a positive step, much more needs to be done. Life-saving aid to millions of civilians in need must be delivered now, and access to food and water, electricity and fuel ensured. The vast majority of the population is already displaced, sheltering in overcrowded facilities, including schools that no longer provide education, or simply sleeping on the streets. Healthcare services are in tatters, and of growing concern is the high risk of epidemic and waterborne diseases, which would further compound the crisis. Iceland has responded to UN emergency appeals with increased contributions to UNRWA, our long-standing humanitarian partner. UNRWA services, the lifeline for over 2.2 million people in Gaza, are now on the verge of collapse, according to Commissioner General Lazzarini. If UNRWA fails, the entire humanitarian system in Gaza will follow. We must spare no efforts in preventing this from happening. We deplore that more than 130 UNRWA staff members have been killed in this conflict. Iceland has condemned in the strongest possible terms the brutal and indiscriminate terrorist attacks by Hamas 2 months ago. We have repeatedly called for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as the resolution we have just adopted rightly does. All parties to this conflict must adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law. Breaches thereof must be carefully investigated, including of sexual violence. Mr. President, the Secretary General has rightly raised the alarm of further escalation of this conflict. Its consequences are being felt throughout the region and beyond. Across the world, people are calling for the hostilities to end. So did the Icelandic Parliament in a unanimous resolution on November the 9th. Even in the midst of crisis, when peace seems unrealistic and distant, we must focus on the long-term sustainable solution to the conflict, which two-state solution based on international law, with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security and mutual recognition. The cycle of violence must stop. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Iceland. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. La Suisse a voté oui à la résolution adoptée par cette Assemblée aujourd'hui. Cette résolution répond au plus pressant, la protection des civils et l'accès rapide, sûr et sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire aux populations dans le besoin à Gaza où, je cite, « nul n'est plus en sécurité aujourd'hui et où le système humanitaire risque un effondrement complet », comme l'a dit le secrétaire général. La Suisse a soutenu cette résolution et demande sa mise en œuvre, sachant que le cessez-le-feu humanitaire est compris comme une pause humanitaire limitée dans le temps, sans porter préjudice au droit d'Israël d'assurer sa défense et sa sécurité. La Suisse continue d'appeler les parties à respecter, en toutes circonstances, leurs obligations en vertu du droit international humanitaire et des droits humains, notamment pour ce qui est de la protection des civils israéliens comme palestiniens, et ce, indépendamment de l'adoption de résolutions par les principaux organes des Nations Unies. L'accès humanitaire à travers tous les points de passage possibles, ainsi que le respect des principes de proportionnalité, de distinction et de précaution dans la conduite des hostilités font partie de ces obligations. Le respect est aussi une nécessité afin de prévenir une escalade régionale du conflit, notamment en Cisjordanie et au Liban. La Suisse a également voté oui aux amendements proposés par l'Autriche et les États-Unis et regrette qu'il n'ait pas été adopté. L'amendement autrichien aurait contribué à préciser que l'accès humanitaire doit être immédiat, ce qui correspond aux demandes répétées du secrétaire général et d'autres hauts représentants d'organisations humanitaires impartiales au vu de l'urgence humanitaire qui règne à Gaza. L'adoption de cet amendement aurait aussi permis de désigner clairement les parties responsables des prises d'otages, y compris le Hamas et d'autres groupes. Enfin, nous avons soutenu dès le 7 octobre une condamnation explicite des actes de terreur perpétrés par le Hamas et aurions préféré qu'elle soit incluse dans la résolution, comme le proposait l'amendement américain. Monsieur le Président, dans l'immédiat, la mise en place de cessez-le-feu à des fins humanitaires et la fourniture d'aide doivent urgemment sauver des vies et permettre aux acteurs et actrices humanitaires d'accomplir leur travail en toute sécurité. Mais ces mesures ne sauraient être des fins en soi. La Suisse continuera de s'engager en vue d'une solution politique au conflit, conformément au droit international. Je vous remercie.
I thank the distinguished representative of Switzerland. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Philippines.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, while we condemn the October 7 terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas, the Philippines emphasizes adherence to international humanitarian law, especially the principles of proportionality and distinction in response to security threats. It is imperative that any military action consider the impact on civilians and strives to minimize, if not eliminate, collateral damage. We are deeply concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. The Philippines believes strongly that a humanitarian ceasefire is crucial to halt the loss of life and suffering. This ceasefire is a necessary step to facilitate the delivery of urgent humanitarian aid to all affected civilians, irrespective of their affiliation. We call on all parties to comply with their obligations under international law, particularly regarding the protection of civilians, especially women and children. Upholding these laws is essential in ensuring the safety and dignity of all individuals affected by this conflict. Finally, the Philippines seeks to contribute to a solution that respects the rights and needs of both Palestinian and Israeli civilians. We advocate for a peaceful resolution that upholds international law and leads to lasting peace and security in the region. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Philippines. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, Sri Lanka condemns terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. Similarly, we have condemned the attacks that took place on 7th October. However, the thrust of Resolution L27 just adopted and which Sri Lanka co-sponsored is entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations. It focuses on the UN Secretary General's call invoking Article 99 of the UN Charter, the letter of 7 December by the head of UNRWA. It expresses concern at the humanitarian situation in Gaza, emphasizes the need for the protection of civilians, both Israeli and Palestinian, calls upon all parties to exercise maximum restraint, demands an immediate ceasefire, the unconditional release of hostages held by all parties, and reiterates the demand for all parties to comply with their obligations under humanitarian law. The resolution L27 does not seek to condemn any party to the conflict or seek to apportion blame on any party. The amendments L28 presented by Austria and L29 presented by the USA seek to apportion blame only on one party. The adoption of either would have diverted the focus of the resolution and made it manifestly imbalanced. Sri Lanka therefore voted against both amendments. Thank you.
I thank distinguished representative of Sri Lanka. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Portugal.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome the General Assembly resolution adopted today. While deeply disappointed that the use of veto has hindered the Security Council, we must remain seized of the urgency of the situation and continue to press for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Today, the General Assembly took a clear stance in demanding full respect for international humanitarian law and the protection of civilian populations, in demanding the unconditional and immediate release of hostages and the ensuring of unhindered and sustained humanitarian aid. We sincerely hope that these calls, echoing the ones timely made by the Secretary General of the United Nations and other representatives of the UN system, will be heeded. The situation on the ground in the Gaza Strip is unbearable, with a mounting number of casualties, many, far too many of them, women and children, and huge numbers of displaced people. The fighting must be halted. It also remains crucial to avoid the spread of the conflict to the West Bank and beyond by accident or calculated action. We encourage the continuation of regional and international efforts, both in multilateral and bilateral spheres, to prevent a spillover. We need to return to the diplomatic track breaking this cycle of violence and extremism. It is our collective responsibility to address the structural drivers of this conflict. This will require a renewed involvement of all relevant actors and a determined effort to implement the United Nations Security Council resolutions on the matter and set a clear and solid path to a Palestinian state, fulfilling the two-state solution. Mr. President, once again, Portugal reiterates its unequivocal condemnation of the heinous terrorist attacks by Hamas on October the 7th. Terrorism in all its forms should be condemned. For this reason, we supported the amendments presented today as they aimed at that purpose without compromising the message that was strongly supported regarding the situation in Gaza. Gaza needs a swift, unhindered, and scaled-up response. Gaza needs all parts to comply by their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights. Gaza needs a humanitarian ceasefire, as this resolution makes clear. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Portugal. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Hungary.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are here today to discuss the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, ignited by the horrendous and brutal acts of terrorism committed by Hamas on 7 October. Hungary condemns these brutal and barbaric attacks in the strongest possible terms, and we would have hoped for the General Assembly to do accordingly after 2 months of silence on this issue. We find it unacceptable that today's resolution once again failed to condemn the barbaric attacks that have led to today's events, including continuous indiscriminate rocket attacks against Israeli civilians. We also condemn the use of Palestinian civilians, civilian infrastructure, and hospitals as human shields by Hamas. These acts are flagrant violations of international humanitarian law. In face of such violent terrorist attacks, Hungary strongly emphasizes Israel's inherent right to defend itself in accordance with international law and international humanitarian law. All parties must uphold and respect their obligations under international humanitarian law. All civilian life matters equally. In this vein, we recall the resolution adopted by the Security Council calling for urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and corridors throughout the Gaza Strip, and recalling all parties' obligation to act in compliance with international humanitarian law, notably with regard to the protection of civilians, especially children. We welcome that finally 2 months after 7 October attacks, the General Assembly is now calling for the release of the hostages held by Hamas. We once again call on Hamas and other terrorist groups within Gaza to release all remaining hostages immediately and without precondition, cease hostilities, and spare all civilians from further suffering. We recall that there are Hungarian citizens who are also being held hostage by the terrorists. It is crucial that the ICRC is granted access to the hostages, and thereby humanitarian assistance and medical support reaches those held in captivity as well. Taking hostages is a grave violation of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, immediate, safe, sustainable, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid is required through all necessary measures, including humanitarian corridors and pauses for humanitarian needs. Food, water, medical care, fuel, and shelter should be able to reach the most vulnerable, whilst ensuring that such aid is not abused by terrorist organizations. The hostilities are severely impacting hospitals and taking a horrific toll on medical and humanitarian staff, including United Nations personnel. Their safety and security must also be ensured. We must utilize our collective efforts, capabilities, and engagement in order to avoid a spillover to the region, as it would have even more devastating humanitarian consequences. Mr. President, there are the reasons why we supported the amendments submitted by Austria and the United States. And these are the exact same reasons why we couldn't support the resolution. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Hungary. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Republic of Moldova.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the Republic of Moldova voted in favor of the draft resolution L27 entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations. My country has joined other UN member states in strongly condemning the Hamas brutal and terrorist attack against Israel on 7th of October, since there is no justification for terror. Furthermore, my country recognizes Israel's right to self-defense in accordance with international law, including international humanitarian law. In this respect, Moldova has supported and would have welcomed the inclusion of the amendments proposed by the United States and Austria in the draft resolution. Nevertheless, the urgency of the situation on the ground brought us to support this resolution. We deeply sympathize with all the innocent victims, Israeli, Palestinians, citizens from many other countries, as well as the UN staff members. Palestinian and Israeli civilians population must be protected. All hostages held by Hamas and other groups must be released immediately and unconditionally. Full and unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance must be provided throughout Gaza. Likewise, safe passage must be assured to all those who wish to leave Gaza. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Republic of Moldova. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Liechtenstein.
Mr. President, my delegation has voted in favor of the resolution adopted by this Assembly. We have done so in light of the catastrophic humanitarian situation on the ground described by the relevant UN agencies, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and others. We had already supported a similar call by this Assembly in late October and note the positive, albeit short, reprieve for the affected civilian populations during the period when fighting finally ceased, both with respect to the release of hostages and the delivery of urgently needed humanitarian assistance. The situation today is even more distressing, and we are therefore supportive of a humanitarian ceasefire, as called for by the Secretary General, which was unfortunately blocked by the use of the veto last Friday in the Security Council. We are also fully supportive of the calls for the full respect for international humanitarian law by conflict parties, the call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as provisions concerning humanitarian assistance. While the resolution addresses immediate priorities to protect civilians, it does not comprehensively reflect our position. We have therefore supported the amendment put forward by the United States, as we agree that the condemnation of the terrorist attacks by Hamas by a political body of the United Nations would have been important and necessary. Ideally, this condemnation would have happened in the Security Council itself on October the 8th, in accordance with established Council practice, immediately after the attack on the civilian population in Israel, when unfortunately no text to this effect was considered, or in one of the early subsequent meetings of the Council. Absent that, we have voted for the second time in the emergency special session for an amendment proposal along these lines. Mr. President, the last few weeks have demonstrated the necessity of diplomacy in the face of an unprecedented crisis of the protection of civilians. The progress made in this area between the 24th and the 30th of November came in accordance with the terms of a resolution adopted in the most recent convening of the emergency special session, as well as with those of Council Resolution 2712. We deplore the veto cast on Friday in the Council, which blocked a decision supported by a very clear majority in the Council and in a wider membership as well. We encourage you, Mr. President, as you have done before in meetings resulting from use of the veto, produce a summary of this meeting for transmission to the Security Council. Mr. President, we welcome the leadership of Secretary General Guterres and his personal engagement for the protection of civilians. We support his decision to invoke Article 99 highlighted in today's resolution and hope that this indicates a renewed willingness to use this powerful tool in other situations where warranted. Liechtenstein condemns in the strongest possible terms the heinous terrorist attacks against Israel by Hamas and other groups and the massive violations of international humanitarian law they have committed. We call again for the unconditional and immediate release of all remaining hostages. We also underline again the need for full, immediate, safe, unhindered and sustained humanitarian access and the call for the full respect of international humanitarian law by all parties and that access is granted to humanitarian organizations to provide the necessary emergency relief. 133 UNRWA staff and many other humanitarian workers have now died in Gaza, the highest number of UN casualties in any operation since the founding of our organization. We condemn deliberate attacks on humanitarian workers and pay tribute to those who have lost their lives while acting to save the lives of others and alleviate suffering in extreme circumstances. The denial of humanitarian access to civilians and attacks against humanitarian workers are both prohibited under the Fourth Geneva Convention and its additional protocols and may amount to a war crime. Mr. President, Liechtenstein called for accountability for serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, including through the ongoing investigations of the International Criminal Court, which has jurisdiction over the most serious crimes under international law committed on the territory of the State of Palestine and by Palestinian nationals. We are particularly concerned by the numerous reports of sexual and gender-based violence committed by Hamas. All such reported crimes must be vigorously investigated and prosecuted. We are further deeply concerned by the massive escalation of violence in the West Bank, in particular extremist settler violence. Mr. President, the time for diplomacy is now. It is too late to avert the horror of human suffering and the shocking loss of human life, but it's not too late to bring an end to the ongoing catastrophe. The inalienable rights of both Israeli and Palestinian peoples can only be ensured by upholding their respective right to self-determination expressed through a two-state solution. Serious, committed, and legitimate interlocutors ready for genuine engagement for peace are a prerequisite, as is the strong support of the international community. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Poland.
Mr. President, Poland's support for the UN General Assembly resolution entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations stems from our long-standing commitment to the principles of international humanitarian law. The multilateralism and the rule-based international order have always been and remain Poland's top priority. Therefore, we express our strong support for the Secretary General and the United Nations, commending their invaluable efforts in addressing the crisis in the Gaza Strip. Poland's commitment to the aforementioned values reflects our involvement in efforts to alleviate the dire humanitarian situation of the population in the Middle East and to restore peace in the region. For decades, Poland has been involved in humanitarian and development aid projects in the Middle East, with particular focus on Palestine, including Gaza, Lebanon, and Jordan. Mr. President, in the light of the current situation, our position remains very clear. We remain concerned over the dramatic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. We support all international coordination aimed at restoring calm and a speedy and continued flow of humanitarian aid to the civilians in Gaza. We also express our gratitude to the personnel and of international organizations, UN agencies, especially that of the UNRWA. Poland decided to provide additional funds amounting to over $2 million to be used by UNRWA, WFP, and the UNICEF's Gaza Fund. We strongly underline that the humanitarian assistance should be distributed by UN agencies in order not to fall in the hands of terrorists. Mr. President, At the same time, we stress that terrorism aimed at the civilian population is never justified and cannot be tolerated under any circumstances. We reiterate our conviction that Israel, like any other country, has the right to defend itself and its citizens. However, we wish to stress that this must take place in compliance with international law, including the humanitarian law. The civilian population must be protected. We reiterate our strong condemnation of the barbaric terrorist attacks by Hamas and other Gaza militant groups that brought death and suffering to the innocent people of Israel. We also continue our call for an immediate and unconditional release of all hostages taken by Hamas. In this vein, the amendments presented by the US and Austria correspond with our position. We believe they offered a valuable and important contribution to the document. That is why we decided also to support them. And I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Poland. I now give a floor to distinguished representative of Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. صوتت تونس لصالح هذا القرار باعتبار مطالبته بوقف فوري إنساني لإطلاق النار وإنهاء العدوان الوحشي المتواصل على المدنيين الفلسطينيين في قطاع غزة وبقية الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة لأكثر من 60 يوما، بكل ما حملته من مآس إنسانية غير مسبوقة وفظائع وجرائم حرب لقوات الاحتلال ضد الأطفال والنساء والشيوخ والعائلات والمرضى والطواقم الطبية وعمال الإغاثة الإنسانية وموظفي الأمم المتحدة والصحفيين. كنا نتمنى أن يتم اعتماد هذا القرار في مجلس الأمن الذي أثبت مرة أخرى ارتهانه للحسابات السياسية وعجزه الواضح عن تحمل مسؤولياته القانونية والأخلاقية وترميم مصداقيته وصورته. نحيي موقف الأمين العام وتفعيله للمادة 99 من الميثاق، ونجدد مطالبة المجتمع الدولي ومجلس الأمن بتحمل المسؤولية وفرض احترام القانون الدولي والقانون الدولي الإنساني والقانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان، باعتبار ذلك واجبا وحاجة ملحة وليس خيارا، ومساءلة ومحاسبة قوات الاحتلال على كل ما اقترفته وتقترفه في حق الشعب الفلسطيني من مجازر وجرائم إبادة وتنكيل وسط صمت دولي مريب جعلها تتمادى في عدوانها واستهتارها بكل المواثيق. لا يمكن المساواة بين الضحية والجلاد وبين المحتل والمحاصرين والمهجرين والذين تمارس ضدهم كل أشكال العقاب الجماعي والانتهاكات، فالمدنيون المحتاجون للحماية هم الفلسطينيون الذين تلاحقهم آلة القتل الإسرائيلية في كل مكان، وهم الذين شاهد العالم تنكيل قوات الاحتلال بهم أثناء تهجيرهم بتجريدهم من ملابسهم وتعريضهم لأقصى أشكال الإهانة، وهم الذين يقبع الآلاف منهم منذ عقود أسرى في سجون الاحتلال الذي يواصل إيقافاته التعسفية لآلاف آخرين. من المفارقات أن احتفال المجتمع الدولي بالذكرى 75 للإعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان يتزامن مع تواصل هذه المأساة واستمرار التآكل التدريجي للمبادئ التي تحمي كرامة الإنسان وتحترم أبسط حقوقه، وفي مقدمتها الحق في الحياة، الذي يتم الدوس عليه والإمعان في انتهاكه من قبل قوات الاحتلال وتجاهله من قبل من هم مسؤولون عن صونه في مؤسسات العمل متعدد الأطراف. إن الحياة لحظة وموقف، ونحن إزاء هذه اللحظة وأمام ضمائرنا وواجباتنا، حيث لن يغفر التاريخ تهاون المجتمع الدولي في وقف العدوان ووضع حد لمعاناة الشعب الفلسطيني والسكوت عن قتل أكثر من 18,000 مدني وموت طفل كل 5 دقائق وقصف وتدمير أكثر من 300,000 بيت وتهجير أكثر من 1.5 مليون فلسطيني واستهداف المستشفيات والمدارس ودور العبادة وإفراغ مبادئ القانون الدولي ومنظومة حقوق الإنسان من معانيها. من المهم اعتماد مثل هذا القرار، ولكن من الأهم السهر على تنفيذه وتنفيذ بقية القرارات السابقة، ولذلك نجدد مطالبتنا بتحرك دولي فاعل ومسؤول بعيدا عن سياسات الكيل بمكيالين والمعايير المزدوجة لتوفير الحماية للشعب الفلسطيني ووضع حد لجرائم الاحتلال. ستواصل تونس وقوفها إلى جانب الشعب الفلسطيني ودعمها الثابت والمبدئي لحقه في تقرير المصير والحرية والاستقلال وإقامة دولته المستقلة ذات السيادة على أرض فلسطين وعاصمتها القدس الشريف. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Ghana.
President, Ghana has consistently maintained that the international community has a responsibility to help end the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in the Gaza Strip. A few days ago, we supported a similar draft resolution in the Security Council towards achieving this objective, and we did same today because we believe it is the right thing to do at this time. We reiterate our condemnation of the unwarranted attacks by Hamas that began on 7th October, and our demand for all hostages to be released unconditionally. We reaffirm our commitment to the two-state solution and express the hope that the current international mediation efforts would help to end the cycle of violence on a permanent basis. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ghana. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Italy.
Mr. President, let me first thank the President of the General Assembly, Francis, for promptly convening and chairing this emergency special session. Let me begin by joining the other delegations in acknowledging the tireless efforts of the United Nations and all humanitarian partners on the ground who are delivering assistance under extreme conditions. Turning to today's proceedings, Italy abstained on the resolution protecting of civilians and upholding legal and humanitarian obligations just adopted and promoted by Egypt, whom we would like to wholeheartedly thank. Italy is deeply concerned for the humanitarian emergency in Gaza and is working bilaterally and with our international and regional friends and partners to alleviate the suffering of civilians, because in this conflict the most vulnerable ones, children, women and elderly, are those who are paying the highest toll. Italy is helping to treat injured Palestinians and also children in partnership with the UAE. We provided extra assistance to Palestinians through the United Nations agencies. We are in close contact with our close Arab friends and partners in the region to explore ways to achieve a sustainable peace and stability in the region. In this vein, we would support initiatives aimed at de-escalation, including humanitarian pauses, to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance, the protection of civilians, and the liberation of all hostages. We decided, however, to abstain because there are many elements that are still missing from the resolution, and namely the unequivocal condemnation of the brutal, indiscriminate terrorist attacks by Hamas against innocent civilians on October 7th. We have already reiterated our outright condemnation several times. We would have hoped to see it incorporated in the text just adopted, and we reaffirm again today, hoping that the time when this Assembly and the Security Council could finally deplore such atrocious crimes and recognize Hamas' sole responsibility for the brutal attack of October 7th is near. For those reasons, we voted in favor of the amendments proposed by the United States and Austria. There is no justification for terror, and there should be accountability for the 7th of October crimes. Let me recall on this the initiative that Italy, together with France and Germany, has recently launched in the EU, asking for additional individual sanctions against Hamas supporters. In face of such terrorist threat, Italy recognizes the legitimate right of self-defense of Israel. We stress at the same time that the exercise of such a right of self-defense needs to be in full compliance with international law and international humanitarian law. We have asked, and we will continue to ask, Israel to do its utmost to minimize civilian victims. Finally, we should not lose sight of the broader picture. We firmly believe that the only viable solution to peace in the Middle East remains the two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Italy. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. لقد صوتت بلادي لصالح القرار الذي اعتمدته الجمعية العامة قبل قليل لكونه يمثل تعبيرا صادقا عن ضمير العالم والإنسانية، ويطالب بإيقاف فوري للعدوان الوحشي على الشعب الفلسطيني الشقيق. ويجدد وفدي تحفظه على بعض الصياغات الواردة فيه التي قد يفهم منها المساواة بين المحتل الإسرائيلي والشعب الفلسطيني الرازح تحت الاحتلال، بين الجلاد والضحية. السيد الرئيس، أتوجه بالشكر لكم سعادة السفير دينيس فرانسيس رئيس الجمعية العامة على استئناف الدورة الاستثنائية الطارئة العاشرة للجمعية العامة لمناقشة الوضع الخطير في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة في ظل حالة الشلل التي يواجهها مجلس الأمن جراء قيام الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية بمنعه من تحمل مسؤولياته في الحفاظ على السلم والأمن الدوليين، وإصرارها على منح إسرائيل الضوء الأخضر للاستمرار بعدوانها الوحشي في غزة. كما نشيد بالخطوة الشجاعة للسيد أنطونيو غوتيريش الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة واطلاعه بمسؤولياته بالرغم من الحملات الشرسة التي يتعرض لها، وذلك من خلال تنبيهه مجلس الأمن بموجب المادة 99 من الميثاق إلى أن ما يجري في قطاع غزة هو مسألة تهدد السلم والأمن الدوليين. وتعرب بلادي عن أسفها وعميق قلقها جراء الوضع المتردي في قطاع غزة، وهو ما أشار إليه المفوض العام لوكالة الأونروا في رسالته إلى رئيس الجمعية العامة، والتي يبلغه فيها بأن قدرة الأونروا على مواصلة تنفيذ ولايتها في غزة قد أصبحت الآن محدودة للغاية، مؤكداً أن الأونروا تعيش أحلك الظروف في تاريخها، داعياً الجمعية العامة للتحرك الفوري. السيد الرئيس، نستأنف هذه الدورة اليوم وللمرة الثانية خلال أقل من شهرين لتدارك إصرار الولايات المتحدة وبعض الدول الغربية على تصفية القضية الفلسطينية وقتل أطفال فلسطين دعماً للكيان الإسرائيلي الذي يقوم بحملة إبادة غير مسبوقة راح ضحيتها حتى الآن أكثر من 18,000 شهيد، أغلبهم من النساء والأطفال، وذلك في حملة همجية لم توفر فيها إسرائيل حتى الصحفيين والموظفين الأمميين، فضلاً عن إمعانها بتدمير البنية التحتية والاستمرار في حصارها اللا إنساني لقطاع غزة ومنع إيصال المساعدات الإنسانية واستخدام الأسلحة المحرمة دولياً بما في ذلك القنابل الفسفورية الحارقة والتهديد باستخدام القنبلة الذرية واتباع سياسة الدمار الشامل، مرتكبة بذلك مختلف صنوف جرائم الحرب وجرائم ضد الإنسانية والتطهير العرقي والإبادة الجماعية، ضاربة بعرض الحائط كافة القوانين الدولية والمبادئ الإنسانية. على الجميع أن يدرك أن ما يجري اليوم في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة لم يبدأ في 7 تشرين الأول، وإنما بدأ قبل عقود طويلة جراء الإنكار الإسرائيلي المستمر لحق الشعب الفلسطيني في إقامة دولته المستقلة وعاصمتها القدس، وما رافق ذلك من استمرار للاحتلال وإمعان في الممارسات العدوانية منذ العام 1948. إن استخدام الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية للفيتو مجدداً في مجلس الأمن ووقوفها ضد إرادة الغالبية العظمى من أعضاء المجلس وإسقاطها لمشروع قرار لم يكن الهدف منه إلا وقف إطلاق نار إنساني يشكل إهانة مخزية للمعايير الإنسانية ويكشف أكذوبة الحرص على أرواح المدنيين، ويثبت بما لا يدع مجالا للشك أن واشنطن ودولا غربية أخرى تخوض الحرب في قطاع غزة إلى جانب الاحتلال الإسرائيلي بهدف وحيد، هو إفناء الشعب الفلسطيني وإقامة ما يسمى بإسرائيل الكبرى على إشلاء أطفال فلسطين ونسائها بعد تدمير منازلهم وإرثهم الحضاري. فبدلا من السماح لمجلس الأمن بالاطلاع بمسؤولياته بعد أكثر من شهرين على المجازر والإبادة الجماعية، جاء الفيتو الأمريكي ليحمي مجرمي الحرب وليعطيهم رخصة جديدة لمواصلة ارتكاب المجازر والتدمير والتهجير. إنه لمن المفارقة أن الدولة التي تتشدق بشعارات الديمقراطية وحماية حقوق الإنسان، والتي يفترض أن تساهم في حفظ السلم والأمن الدوليين، تمنع مجلس الأمن من الاطلاع بمسؤولياته في وقف العدوان الإسرائيلي، مما يفضح النهج المنحاز في سياساتها عندما يتعلق الأمر بحماية إسرائيل وضمان إفلاتها من المساءلة على انتهاكاتها للقانون الدولي وأحكام ميثاق الأمم المتحدة. لقد شهدنا جميعا كيف أن فشل مجلس الأمن مرات عدة قد شجع إسرائيل بعد أن أنهت الهدنة على التمادي بإجرامها الممنهج دون أدنى رادع بذريعة حقها المزعوم في الدفاع عن النفس، في الوقت الذي تتباكى فيه بعض الدول الغربية على قيم الإنسانية في مناطق أخرى من العالم في صورة صارخة للنفاق الدولي والازدواجية التعاطي مع قيم الحق والعدل وفق مصالح الدول الغربية الكبرى. وأقول لهذه الدول وهي تعرف نفسها: لن نصدقكم مرة أخرى. السيد الرئيس، تشعل إسرائيل اليوم المنطقة وتدفعها نحو تفجير لا يمكن احتوائه من خلال جرائمها الوحشية المستمرة في فلسطين، والتي تتزامن مع ممارساتها العدوانية في الجولان العربي السوري المحتل واعتداءاتها المتكررة على أراضي الجمهورية العربية السورية من خلال استهدافها للمطارات المدنية والبنى التحتية، بالإضافة إلى اعتداءاتها على لبنان في انتهاك فاضح للقانون الدولي ولأحكام الميثاق. الأمر الذي يثبت مجدداً أن إسرائيل ليست إلا أداة لنشر الفوضى في المنطقة وإشاعة الإرهاب فيها، وهي السبب الرئيس لتهديد السلم والأمن الإقليمي والدولي، وكل ذلك بغطاء من الولايات المتحدة وحلفائها الذين لجأوا مؤخراً إلى حشد أساطيلهم على الشواطئ الشرقية للبحر المتوسط وتقديم الدعم المادي والعسكري منقطع النظير لأداتهم الكيان الإسرائيلي. ختاماً، السيد الرئيس، تؤكد الجمهورية العربية السورية مجدداً وقوفها إلى جانب الشعب الفلسطيني الشقيق في نضاله لتحرير أرضه المحتلة وإقامة دولته المستقلة ذات السيادة وعاصمتها القدس، وتشدد على ضرورة الوقف الفوري للعدوان الإسرائيلي وتقديم الدعم الإنساني العاجل للشعب الفلسطيني في قطاع غزة ومنع التهجير القسري وضمان مساءلة إسرائيل وداعميها عن تلك الجرائم وعدم إفلاتهم من العقاب. شكراً السيد الرئيس.
I thank the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic. I now give a floor to distinguished representative of Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, коллеги, мир вот уже на протяжении более 2 месяцев является свидетелем того, как в зоне Палестино-израильского конфликта разгорается чудовищная драма. Буквально каждый час в Газе гибнут десятки ни в чем не повинных мирных жителей. Отмечаем усилия арабской группы во главе с Египтом по подготовке соответствующего проекта резолюции Генеральной Ассамблеи ООН с требованиями прекращения огня и немедленного освобождения заложников для предотвращения гуманитарной катастрофы в Газе. Со своей стороны выступили конспонсорами инициативы арабских стран и надеемся, что вслед за Генассамблеей и Совет Безопасности сможет наконец-то выполнить свои обязательства. Тем более, что представители Объединенных Арабских Эмиратов подготовили и внесли на рассмотрение СБ еще один проект по наращиванию и мониторингу доставки гуманитарной помощи в Газу. Уважаемые коллеги, фактически на наших с вами глазах реализуется план бомбить сектор Газа в каменный век. Масштаб этой катастрофы вынудил генерального секретаря ООН впервые за долгие годы прибегнуть к своим полномочиям по статье 99 Устава ООН и призвать Совет Безопасности ООН принять решение о прекращении кровопролития. С горечью вынужден констатировать, что за все это время коллективные усилия в рамках ООН не привели к нужному результату. Но причина не в том, что многосторонняя дипломатия пробуксовывает. И дело не в неспособности Совета Безопасности выполнить свое предназначение, как об этом говорят некоторые, в том числе сегодня. Давайте называть вещи своими именами. Причина в том, что на пути всех миротворческих усилий глухим заслоном стоят Соединенные Штаты. С самого начала США прямо отвергали многостороннюю дипломатию. От американских представителей мы слышали, что пока Вашингтон занимается двусторонней тихой дипломатией на земле, никому не надо в это вмешиваться, чтобы, мол, ему не мешать. Вот главная причина того, что Совет Безопасности ООН за все это время не смог принять никаких решительных мер. Целый ряд его членов предлагал проекты решений по урегулированию ситуации, добросовестно, почти круглосуточно вел по ним напряженные переговоры. ОАЭ, Россия и Китай на постоянной основе запрашивают заседание Совета для обсуждения ситуации в Газе, чего, кстати, ни разу не сделали наши западные коллеги. Россия еще 16 октября предложила самый первый проект о немедленном прекращении огня. Западные делегации его не поддержали. Из-за американского вето не прошел и бразильский проект, набравший достаточную поддержку членов СБ. С тех пор произошло много страшных событий, которые выявили безальтернативность того, о чем мы говорили с самого начала. Однозначного требования к сторонам прекратить боевые действия и насилие. Именно требования, а не просьбы, как и подобает Совету Безопасности. СБ ООН вплотную подошел к такому решению 8 декабря. Вокруг проекта с положением прекращения огня, сформулированного арабской группой и внесенного от имени ОАЭ, сплотилось более 100 соавторов. Короткий, простой и жизненно важный документ, как его охарактеризовали авторы из делегации Объединенных Арабских Эмиратов, содержал также требования гуманитарного доступа и освобождения заложников, то есть подтверждал необходимость полного и неукоснительного соблюдения норм международного гуманитарного права, прежде всего по защите гражданского населения в условиях вооруженного конфликта. Иными словами, текст содержал все то, о чем в своем беспрецедентном обращении в СБ просил генсекретарь. Мы высоко оцениваем усилия Абу-Даби по подготовке и продвижению данного документа, мужественную и последовательную линию эмиратских коллег. В итоге их проект получил поддержку 13 членов Совета Безопасности. Однако США вновь, как и 18 октября, выгораживая своего главного ближневосточного союзника, заветировали решение СБ, а Великобритания не нашла в себе смелости оставить Вашингтон в одиночестве и воздержалась. Итог таких шагов англосаксонского тандема – продолжение чудовищного кровопролития, новые тысячи погибших и катастрофические разрушения. Заветировав призыв к прекращению огня, американская сторона фактически выдала лицензию на убийство и теперь несет всю полноту ответственности за каждую новую жертву конфликта в Газе. Делить эту вину с ними остальные члены Совета Безопасности ООН и члены ООН в целом не должны. Уважаемые коллеги, я только что вернулся из поездки ряда членов Совета Безопасности и новых членов СБ на контрольно-пропускной пункт Рафах, организованный ОАЭ и Египтом. Там мы имели возможность пообщаться с местными властями, сотрудниками египетского и палестинского Красного полумесяца, представителями БАПОР и страновой команды ООН, НПО, посетить госпиталь в Эль-Арише и пообщаться по видеосвязи с сотрудниками полевого госпиталя Объединенных Арабских Эмиратов в Газе, побывать на опреснительной станции, построенной Эмиратами на границе с сектором, ну и, естественно, посетить КПП «Рафах». Эта поездка позволила нам лучше представить, что происходит в анклаве. Покалеченные дети в больнице, мать с ампутированными конечностями, потерявшая всю семью, но родившая ребенка, сотни готовых к отправке грузовиков с гумпомощью, которые ждут многочисленных проверок в Египте, Израиле, а потом снова в Египте, а потом по каплям пропускаются в Газу. В секторе ужасающая гуманитарная катастрофа, и с каждым днем-то становится все хуже. Хотя представить, что может быть хуже того, что сейчас, невозможно. Ото всех наших собеседников мы слышали только одно. Необходимо прекращение огня. Необходимо остановить эту бойню. Мне на память приходит блокада Ленинграда нацистами во время Второй мировой войны, которая длилась почти 900 дней и унесла в результате бомбардировок и голода жизни более чем 1 миллиона ленинградцев. Неужели Газе уготована такая же судьба? Невозможно себе представить, что это происходит в наше время. Благодарю вас.
I thank the distinguished representative of Russian Federation. We have heard the last speaker in explanation of vote after the vote for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers in explanation of vote after the vote on Friday, 15th of December at 3 p.m. in this hall, to be followed by the resumption of a debate on agenda item 5. The meeting is adjourned.